Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. The light dropped behind the ridge at 2:17 in the morning. I had been watching it for about 4 minutes before that, though at first I thought it was a plane coming toward the tower. I was volunteering as a fire lookout in the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. The tower sat on a narrow peak above the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, about 12 miles from the nearest paved road. It was an old Forest Service structure with a square room on top, windows on all four sides, and a steep metal staircase underneath. I stayed there in week-long shifts during the dry part of the summer. That night, in late August, was cool and clear. There had been lightning storms 2 days earlier, so I was awake checking the horizon every hour for smoke. The moon was low in the west, and the air was still enough that I could hear the generator at a radio site on another ridge several miles away. The light appeared over the northeast tree line. It was brighter than a star, but not as bright as the moon. It moved slowly from left to right, then stopped above Harwood Ridge. I picked up the binoculars. Through the lenses, it looked like a white ball with a faint orange edge. There were no blinking wing lights. I could not see a body around it. It held still for maybe 30 seconds, then moved straight up a short distance. I checked the wall clock. It was 2:13. I tried the radio. Lookout 7 to district, possible aircraft northeast of my position. There was no answer. That was normal at night. The district office was closed, and the radio repeater sometimes failed after midnight. I switched channels and called the county dispatch frequency. Still nothing. The light started moving again. It crossed above the ridge faster than before, stopped, then made a small movement backward. It reminded me of someone dragging a flashlight across a dark room and changing their mind. I lowered the binoculars and watched with my eyes. The light seemed lower now. It dropped toward Harwood Ridge without tilting or circling. There was no engine noise. I knew the distance could have been confusing at night, but it looked close enough that I should have heard something. At 2:17, it disappeared behind the ridge. A pale glow remained above the trees. I expected an explosion or fire. Nothing happened. I marked the location on the fire map and wrote the time in the logbook. Harwood Ridge was about 6 miles northeast of the tower, steep on the western face and heavily forested. There were no roads on that side, only an old trail that had not been maintained in years. I kept watching. The glow faded after maybe 2 minutes. Then a red point appeared lower on the ridge. It blinked once, stayed dark for several seconds, then blinked again. I thought it might be a small fire beginning in the trees. I used the fire finder, the metal sighting device mounted in the center of the room, and took a bearing. The line pointed to a shallow saddle just south of Harwood Peak. I called it in again. No response. I wrote down the bearing and started watching for smoke. About 10 minutes later, the generator sound from the radio site stopped. The silence was immediate. I had gotten used to that distant hum, and when it disappeared, the mountain felt much larger. The tower lights flickered. They were powered by batteries charged through a small solar system. They sometimes dimmed when the refrigerator compressor started, but the refrigerator was not running. The lights flickered again. My handheld radio made a clicking sound. Then the speaker produced a low tone that lasted about 5 seconds. I picked it up. "District, this is Lookout 7. Radio check." A voice answered. It was too quiet to understand, but someone was definitely speaking. I turned the volume up. The voice sounded like a man talking from far away. The words were slow and uneven. I heard something that might have been, "Remain there." I asked the person to repeat. The same low tone returned. Then the radio shut off. I changed the batteries and tried again. It would not power on. I had a backup unit in a metal cabinet near the bed. That one turned on, but the display showed every number at once. After a few seconds, the screen went blank. I looked back toward Harwood Ridge. The red point had moved. It was now lower on the slope, closer to the tree line. I watched it blink 3 times. The intervals were not even. First a few seconds, then maybe 10, then almost a minute. I used the binoculars again. The red light was not in the trees, it was between them. I could see trunks in front of it and behind it, which made it seem small and close to the ground. It moved sideways without bouncing. If someone had been carrying a lantern, I should have seen it rise and fall with their steps. It stopped near the bottom of the saddle. Then another red point appeared about a quarter mile to the right. The two lights blinked back and forth. I checked the access road below my tower. It was empty. I could see most of it in the moonlight as it wound down the mountain. The trail toward Harwood Ridge was hidden by trees. At 2:41, something struck one of the tower supports. It was a dull metallic sound from underneath the floor. I stood still and listened. A second impact came from the staircase side. It did not sound like an animal. Deer and elk sometimes rubbed against the lower supports, but they made scraping noises. This was more like someone hitting the metal with the flat of a hand. I took the flashlight and moved toward the trapdoor. Before I opened it, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow steps. The staircase had 36 metal treads. I knew the sound well because every step rang through the whole structure. The footsteps climbed 4 or 5 steps, then stopped. I called down. No one answered. I had bear spray in a drawer and a 12-gauge shotgun stored unloaded under the bed. I took the bear spray. The footsteps continued. 3 more steps, then 2, then nothing. I crouched near the trapdoor and looked through a narrow gap beside the hinge. I could see part of the upper landing. No one was there. The stairs were lit by moonlight. The railing and metal grating looked empty. A shadow moved across the landing. It passed from right to left, too fast for me to see its shape. I stood up and backed away. The tower windows suddenly fogged. Not all at once. The north window clouded first, then the east. Moisture spread across the inside of the glass, even though the room was dry. The temperature dropped enough that I could see my breath. I heard another step below the trapdoor. This one was directly underneath me. The handle on the trapdoor moved slightly. I had latched it earlier. The latch lifted, fell, then lifted again. I pushed a chair over it and sat on the chair. For the next several minutes, nothing happened. I could hear my breathing and the soft ticking of the stove as it cooled. At 2:52, the windows cleared. The temperature returned to normal. The handheld radio on the table turned on by itself. A voice came through clearly for less than a second. It said my first name, Evan. Then the speaker went dead. I did not respond. I had not used my name over the radio that night. Lookouts identified themselves by station number. The red lights on Harwood Ridge disappeared. I stayed on the chair until nearly 4. Around 3:30, I heard something moving through the brush below the tower. It circled once, then moved downhill. I never saw it. Just before dawn, the regular district frequency came back. A dispatcher named Marcy answered my radio check. She said there had been no reports of aircraft in the area and no emergency traffic overnight. I told her I had seen a bright object descend behind Harwood Ridge and had possibly seen red lights moving through the trees afterward. She asked if I saw smoke. I said no. She told me to keep watching and report anything else. I did not mention the footsteps or the voice saying my name. When the sun came up, Harwood Ridge looked normal. There was no smoke, no burned area, and no visible damage. I used the binoculars to scan the saddle, but trees blocked most of the ground. At 8, I called the district office and spoke to Nolan Reeves, the fire management officer. He said there had been no scheduled flights overnight. He asked if the object could have been a meteor. I told him meteors did not stop, move sideways, and descend slowly. He did not argue. He said he would ask a trail crew to check the area if anyone was heading that way. The rest of the morning was quiet. Around 2 that afternoon, I saw 2 men hiking up the access road. Visitors came to the tower occasionally, but most drove as far as the locked gate and walked the final mile. These men had no vehicle at the gate. I checked with binoculars and could not see one anywhere below them. They walked side by side at the same pace. Both wore gray long-sleeved shirts, dark pants, and plain hiking boots. They carried small canvas packs and each held a folded map. It was warm and sunny by then, but neither looked sweaty when they reached the tower. The taller one called up and asked if I was Evan Mercer. I asked who they were. He said they were with a regional land survey team. I climbed down halfway but stayed on the upper landing. The taller man looked about 40. He had straight black hair, pale skin, and deep lines around his mouth. The other man was older, with a shaved head and wire-framed glasses. Neither had a badge, radio, compass, water bottle, or survey equipment. The older man unfolded his map. It was a topographic map, but it did not match the area. The ridge lines were wrong. Harwood Ridge was shown much closer to the tower, and the creek on the eastern side ran north instead of south. A large circular mark was printed over the saddle where I had seen the object descend. I pointed at it. That's not an accurate map. The older man looked down as if he had not noticed. The taller one asked what time I saw the light. I said 2:17. He asked if it touched the ridge. I couldn't see the ground from here. Did it remain behind the ridge? I don't know. Did it leave the ridge on its own? The wording made me pause. What do you mean, on its own? The taller man looked at the older one. The older man folded the map halfway. We need to know whether it departed without assistance. Assistance from who? Neither answered. The taller man asked if I saw smoke, falling debris, or vehicle lights. I said no. He asked if I heard an impact. I told him I heard something hit the tower supports. That got their attention. Both men looked up at the underside of the tower. The older one asked, at what time? Around 2:40. Before or after the ridge lights separated? I had not mentioned two ridge lights. I asked how he knew about them. He stared at me through his glasses. The taller man said, "You reported intermittent lights. I reported one object." The older man refolded the map so the circular mark was hidden. The taller man asked if anything reached the tower platform. I said no. He looked at the trapdoor above me. Did it attempt to enter? I felt my hand tighten around the railing. I asked again who they worked for. The older man gave the name of a federal office I had never heard of. It sounded official, but he said it too quickly. I told them I was going to call the district. The taller man nodded as though that was fine. Before I could move, he asked one more question. When the voice used your name, did it sound familiar? I did not answer. Neither man smiled or reacted. They just watched me. I climbed back into the tower and picked up the radio. I called Nolan and said 2 men claiming to be surveyors had arrived. Nolan asked for their names. I looked out the window. They were no longer below the tower. I crossed to the west side and saw them walking down the access road. They were already several hundred yards away. That did not seem possible. I had been on the radio for less than 20 seconds. Nolan said no survey team had been scheduled in the area. He contacted the ranger station and sent someone to check the road. A ranger named Beth Alvarez arrived about an hour later. She did not pass the 2 men on the way up. There were no vehicles at the gate or along the lower road. We checked the trail around the tower. The ground was dry and dusty. Beth found my boot prints, deer tracks, and marks from an old ATV. There were no fresh footprints where the men had been standing. I showed her the spot where they unfolded the map. A small square of paper lay under the stairs. It had been torn from one corner of the map. The printed contour lines did not match any local survey format Beth recognized. In the center was part of the circular symbol. The paper felt cold even in direct sunlight. Beth put it in a plastic evidence bag. Then she noticed marks on one of the tower supports. There were 4 shallow dents in the metal, about chest height. Each was narrow and oval-shaped, arranged in a vertical line. I had inspected the supports at the start of my shift. The dents had not been there. Beth photographed them and called the district. She stayed until sunset. At 7:10, the ranger station radioed that someone had found a black car parked near an abandoned logging spur on the east side of Harwood Ridge. It had no plates. When a deputy reached the location, the car was gone. That evening, Beth drove me down from the tower. The district brought in another volunteer for the night shift. I was supposed to stay 3 more days, but Nolan told me to take the rest of the week off. On the road back to Hamilton, we passed the turnoff toward Harwood Ridge. 2 men stood beside the trees near the cattle guard. They were too far away to see clearly, but one was tall and the other had a shaved head. Beth slowed the truck. The taller man raised one arm. He was not waving. He pointed across the road toward the ridge. A pale light appeared between the trees behind them. It was daytime, but the light was bright enough to see. Beth reached for the radio. The screen went blank. The truck engine lost power, and the headlights came on by themselves. We rolled past the turnoff at maybe 15 miles an hour. Neither man moved. The pale light followed us through the trees for about half a mile, appearing between trunks at the same height. It stopped when we reached the paved road. The radio came back. The engine returned to normal. Beth did not turn around. She drove me home before dark. The next morning, Nolan called and said the lookout who replaced me had reported no problems. There were no lights, no radio failures, and no activity around Harwood Ridge. He also said the piece of map Beth collected had disappeared from the evidence cabinet at the ranger station. The plastic bag remained sealed. Inside it was a different piece of paper. It was a section from the official Forest Service map, cut to the same shape. A small black circle had been drawn over the lookout tower. 2 weeks later, I returned to collect the clothes and food I had left behind. I went during the day with Beth. Everything inside the tower was where I had left it. The chair was still beside the trapdoor. The logbook was open on the desk. My entry from 217 had been changed. The original line had said, "Bright object descended behind Harwood Ridge. No smoke visible." Someone had drawn a line through the word "descended." Above it, in neat block letters, they had written, "Returned." I noticed the figure while I was packing the drone into its case. It had been standing in the middle of the field for at least 11 minutes, maybe longer, and I had not seen it once while I was flying. The job was simple. A land agent named Patrick Weller had hired me to get updated aerial footage of a farm outside North Platte, Nebraska. The property was going up for sale, and he wanted wide shots of the fields, the access road, the irrigation equipment, and the old grain bins near the southern fence. I did freelance drone work for real estate companies, roof inspectors, farmers, and sometimes the county. Most of it was boring. I flew a preset grid, checked the images, sent an invoice, and went home. That morning was hot and still. It was early August, just after 9, but the temperature was already in the high 80s. The sky looked washed out from smoke drifting down from fires farther west. There were no clouds and almost no wind. Patrick met me at a locked gate off County Road 27. He was in his late 50s with a red face and a straw hat that looked too clean to be used for actual farm work. He unlocked the chain and told me to drive in about half a mile until I reached a metal equipment shed. He said the place had been empty since spring. The owner had moved into assisted living, and the tenant farmer only came out to check the irrigation lines. Patrick pointed across the property and told me to avoid the northwest corner because there were power lines near the boundary. He also said not to fly over the neighboring house, which was far enough away that it was not going to be an issue. Then he left. I parked beside the shed, set up a folding table, and started checking my equipment. The field nearest me had been cut recently. It was flat, yellow-brown, and almost completely bare except for rows of short stalks. Beyond it, a second field had tall corn. The place felt empty in the normal way. Insects, distant highway noise, an irrigation pump somewhere to the east. Nothing unusual. The first strange thing happened before takeoff. My controller showed a weak GPS signal even though I had a clear view of the sky. I usually locked onto 12 or 15 satellites within seconds. That morning, it moved between 5 and 7. I restarted the controller and drone. The count went up to 11, then dropped back to 6. I checked for nearby towers or power equipment, but the only thing close was the metal shed. I carried the drone 50 yards into the field and tried again. The signal stabilized at 10. That was enough to fly, but not enough for me to trust an automated route, so I decided to control it manually. The drone lifted normally. I took it to 200 feet, made a slow pass toward the grain bins, and checked the video feed. The image looked clear. The horizon was hazy, but the property showed up well. After about 4 minutes, I noticed a dark patch near the center of the cut field. On the controller screen, it looked like a burned section of grass or maybe a piece of equipment. I had walked through that area carrying the drone and had not seen anything. I moved the camera down. The patch disappeared. I assumed the screen had glitched. Sun glare made the display hard to see, and the anti-glare hood did not help much. I adjusted the brightness and continued toward the south fence. A minute later, the drone gave a proximity warning. There was nothing near it. It was 200 feet up over open ground. No trees, no poles, no birds. The warning flashed twice and stopped. I brought the drone lower and flew back toward my position. As it crossed over the field, the video feed broke into blocks for about 3 seconds. The controller beeped and showed a compass error. I looked up. The drone was visible against the pale sky, moving steadily toward me. Then, something crossed below it. At least, I thought something did. It was a quick, dark movement in the field, about halfway between me and the access road. It looked like a person stepping behind something, except there was nothing to step behind. The field was open and flat. I stopped the drone and let it hover. I stared at the area. Nothing moved. I called out, which felt stupid because whoever was there would have been several hundred yards away. Hello? No answer. I looked toward the gate. It was still shut. I could see the chain hanging across it. There were no other vehicles on the property. I raised the camera angle and continued the flight. The drone behaved normally for the next 10 minutes. I recorded the bins, the irrigation circle, the dirt road, and the eastern boundary. I kept looking down at the field, but I did not see the dark movement again. On the final pass, I flew north toward the corn. The controller made a low alert sound I had never heard before. It was not the battery alarm or signal warning. It was a steady tone that lasted about 2 seconds. The video feed dimmed, not black, just darker, like the camera exposure had changed. I checked the settings. They were the same. The drone was at 180 feet, moving north at about 15 miles per hour. The cut field was directly below. That was when I saw the figure on the screen. It stood almost exactly in the center of the field. It was tall and very dark. I could not see clothing, skin, or any detail that made it clearly human. It looked like a person in a long black coat, but the temperature was close to 90 degrees and there was no reason for anyone to be standing there. The figure faced upward. I could not see a face. The head looked pale compared to the body, but the screen was small and the glare made it hard to judge. I stopped the drone. The figure did not move. I tilted the camera straight down. The video feed froze. For about 5 seconds, the screen showed the last image, with the figure near the lower edge. Then the controller went gray and displayed signal lost. I looked up and found the drone. It was still hovering. I tried to reconnect, but nothing happened. The controller showed 0 satellites, then 1, then 0 again. I pressed return to home. No response. The drone remained in place. I started walking toward it. The field was rougher than it looked from the air, with deep tire grooves and dry stalks catching against my boots. I kept looking for the person. I could not see anyone. The drone was maybe 600 feet away, hovering over empty ground. If the figure had been directly below it, I should have seen it from where I was. I walked another 50 yards. The drone suddenly turned east. It did not tilt or accelerate the way it normally did. It rotated slowly in place, then moved sideways for about 20 feet. The controller vibrated in my hands. The video feed returned for less than a second. The image was close to the ground. I saw dry stalks, a strip of dark shadow, and something that looked like 2 legs standing beside the camera. Then the feed cut again. I looked up. The drone was still in the air. That did not make sense. The camera was mounted underneath, and it had been more than 100 feet above the field. There was no way it could have shown a ground-level image unless the video was delayed or corrupted. I stopped walking. The sound of the drone changed. It usually made a high buzzing noise. Now it had a slower, uneven rhythm, like one motor had started failing. The aircraft drifted toward me. I backed up. It moved about 30 feet, stopped, and dropped straight down. Not all the way. It fell maybe 20 feet, caught itself, and hovered again. The controller reconnected. Battery showed 62%. GPS showed 13 satellites. No error messages. The live feed looked normal. The field was empty. I brought the drone back and landed it beside the folding table. The motors shut off. For a few seconds, I heard a faint ticking from inside the body. I thought one of the batteries had overheated, so I removed it and set it on the ground away from the case. The battery was cool. I checked the propellers. No damage, no dirt, nothing wrapped around the motors. I was ready to leave, but I wanted to make sure the footage had saved. I opened the media gallery on the controller and started scrolling through the clips. The first videos looked normal. Grain bins, fence lines, the empty road. Then I opened the last clip. The preview frame showed the field from above. Near the center stood the dark figure. It was clearer in the recorded video than it had been on the live screen. The body looked narrow and too straight. The arms hung against its sides. The head was tilted back at an angle that looked uncomfortable. I pressed play. The video ran for 14 seconds. The drone moved north. The figure appeared near the bottom of the frame. The camera shifted downward. The figure became centered. It did not move, but its shadow did. The sun was behind and to the left of the drone, so the shadow should have fallen northeast. Instead, it pointed almost straight toward the camera. I watched the clip again. On the second viewing, I noticed a second dark shape near the cornfield. It stood at the edge of the tall plants, farther north, smaller because of the distance, but similar. I paused the video. The second shape was partly hidden by the corn. I could not tell whether it was another person or a post. I zoomed in. The controller froze and restarted. When it came back on, the last clip showed a duration of 12 minutes and 41 seconds. I had just watched 14 seconds. I tapped it again. The loading icon spun for a long time, then the screen displayed file error. I removed the memory card from the drone and put it in a plastic case. I had a laptop in my truck, but I decided not to open the file there. The controller was acting strange, and the heat was getting worse. I packed everything except the folding table. While I was closing the hard case, I heard a single knock from inside the equipment shed. It sounded like metal hitting metal. I looked at the building. The main door was secured with a padlock. A smaller side door stood partly open. I had not noticed that before. I walked a few steps toward it and stopped. The opening was narrow and completely dark inside. I called out again. No answer. Another knock came from the shed, then a dragging sound. Something moved across the concrete floor, slow and heavy. I went back to the truck. I threw the table into the bed without folding it, got in, and started the engine. As I drove toward the gate, I kept checking the mirrors. No one came out of the shed. At the halfway point, I passed the spot where the figure had stood. There was a dark circle in the field. It was about 8 feet across. The cut stalks inside it had been pressed flat, all pointing toward the center. The soil looked damp even though it had not rained in more than a week. I did not stop. I reached the gate, got out, and unhooked the chain. The road was empty in both directions. When I turned back toward the truck, I saw movement near the cornfield. A dark figure stood beside the irrigation pipe. It was too far away to see clearly, but it was facing me. I got into the truck, drove through the gate, and left the chain on the ground. I called Patrick from the road. He answered after several rings. I asked if anyone else had been on the property. He said no. I asked about the equipment shed. He went quiet for a moment, then said the side door should have been locked. I told him someone might be inside. Patrick asked if I had seen a vehicle. I said I had not. He said he would call the owner's nephew to check it later. He did not sound concerned. Mostly, he sounded annoyed. I drove home and put the memory card on my desk. Before I could open it, someone knocked on my front door. I lived in a small rental house on the west side of North Platte. It took me about 25 minutes to get there from the farm. I had not told Patrick my home address, but it was listed on my business website. 2 men stood on the porch. Both wore light-colored button-down shirts and dark pants. One was in his 30s, with short blonde hair and a sunburned neck. The other was older, maybe 60, with thick glasses and gray hair cut close to his head. They did not look threatening. They looked like insurance adjusters or county employees. The older man asked if I was Daniel Kerr. I said yes. He asked if I had operated a drone near County Road 27 that morning. I asked who they were. The younger man said they were checking a report involving unauthorized air activity. I asked what agency they worked for. He gave me a name I did not recognize, something with agricultural survey in it. He said it quickly. The older man asked what time I had launched. I told him around 9. He asked for my maximum altitude. I said under 400 feet. He nodded. Then he asked for the exact flight path. I told him I had flown over the listed property and stayed inside the boundary. Did you cross the center field from south to north? He asked. I said I had. Directly through the center? More or less. The 2 men looked at each other. The younger one asked, did the aircraft pass directly overhead? I knew what he meant, but I made him explain. Overhead of what? He looked past me into the house. The ground location. What ground location? The center point of the field. I told him I did not know the exact path without checking the flight log. He asked whether the drone had hovered there. I said it had. How long? Maybe a minute. The older man asked if I had made more than one pass. I said probably. Neither of them asked what I had seen. They did not ask whether I had footage, whether the drone had malfunctioned, or whether anyone else had been on the property. They only cared about the route. The younger man took out a small notebook. Did it fly directly above the standing point? He asked. That wording bothered me. I asked what a standing point was. He stared at me for a few seconds, then said, a survey reference. I told him there had been no marker in the field. He closed the notebook. The older man asked if the drone had landed anywhere besides the launch site. I said no. He looked relieved. The younger man asked if I had walked into the center of the field. I said I had gone partway, but not to the exact location? No. He nodded once. The older man said that was all they needed. I asked for identification. The younger man reached into his pocket and pulled out a black wallet. He opened it for less than a second. I saw a white card with a dark seal, but he held it too far away for me to read. I asked for a business card. He said they did not have any. Then they walked down the driveway. There was no car parked in front of my house. I stepped outside and looked toward the street. A white pickup sat at the corner about half a block away, but neither man walked toward it. They turned into the alley between my house and the neighbor's fence. I followed them to the side yard. The alley was empty. There was nowhere they could have gone without running, and I had not heard footsteps. I went back inside and locked the door. The memory card was not on my desk. I searched the floor, the equipment case, and every pocket in my work bag. I found the plastic holder sitting beside the laptop, but the card itself was gone. I checked the drone. The card slot was empty. I looked through the footage stored on the controller. Most of the low-resolution preview files were still there. The final clip showed a gray thumbnail and would not open. The flight log had recorded the full trip. I opened the map. My route appeared as a blue line across the property. It showed the passes over the bins, the eastern fence, and the irrigation system. The section over the center field was missing. The line stopped on the south side, resumed near the cornfield, and left an empty gap between them. The timestamp jumped from 9:26 to 9:38. I checked the battery data. It showed the drone consuming power during those 12 minutes, but no altitude, speed, direction, or location had been recorded. Near the bottom of the log was a warning I had never seen before. Position occupied. I took a screenshot. When I opened my phone gallery, the image showed the flight map, but the warning had been cut off the bottom. I went back to the controller. The message was gone. Around 6 that evening, Patrick called me. He said the side door of the equipment shed had been closed when his man arrived. The padlock on the main door was still intact. Nothing inside had been disturbed. I asked whether they had checked the field. He said they had. I asked about the dark circle. Patrick said there was no circle. He also said the gate had been chained when they got there. I told him I had left it open. He did not respond for a few seconds. Then he asked if I had completed the job. I said I had enough footage except for one section. The center field, he asked. I had not told him which section was missing. I said yes. He told me not to worry about it. The seller had decided they did not need aerial footage after all. He paid the full invoice that night. 2 days later, I drove back out there with my friend Marcus. I did not bring the drone. The gate had a new chain and a red no trespassing sign. We parked on the shoulder and looked through the fence. The cut field was empty. The equipment shed looked closed. Marcus used binoculars to scan the property. He said he saw a person near the cornfield, but when I looked, there was only a dark vertical shape beside the irrigation pipe. We watched it for several minutes. It never moved. A black SUV came down the county road behind us and slowed. It did not stop. The driver turned his head as he passed. The younger man from my porch was behind the wheel. Marcus asked if I knew him. I said no. We got back in the truck and drove toward town. The SUV stayed behind us for 6 miles, never getting close, never falling far back. When we reached the highway, it turned east and disappeared into the haze. I made it home before dark. The folding table was standing in my driveway. I had left it in the bed of my truck after the flight. I was sure of that. Now it had been unfolded and placed beside the garage. In the center of the tabletop sat the missing memory card. There was no case around it. I did not put it in my computer. I carried it inside with a pair of pliers and dropped it into an empty glass jar. The card had a thin line scratched across the label. The line matched the shape of my flight path. It ran from south to north and stopped at a small round mark in the center. I was halfway across the old Mercer Creek Bridge when I noticed the light under it. It was a little before 5 in the morning, and I was driving one of the county maintenance trucks north on Route 18. I had been called in early because a storm had pushed branches and gravel onto some of the back roads. It was late October, cold enough that I had the heater running, but there was no frost yet. The sky was still black, and a thin fog had settled in the low areas near the creek. The Mercer Creek Bridge was small. 2 lanes, concrete sides, metal railings, maybe 60 feet across. I had driven over it hundreds of times. There was nothing underneath except shallow water, rocks, and a strip of muddy ground on each side. At first I thought the light came from somebody fishing with a lantern. Then I remembered the creek was closed that time of year, and there was no place to park nearby. I slowed down. The light was pale, almost white, but not sharp like headlights. It glowed through the fog under the bridge and lit up the lower branches along the bank. It did not flicker or move. From the road, it looked like someone had hung a large work light beneath the center span. I stopped about 20 yards past the bridge and checked the mirror. The glow remained there, steady and bright. I thought maybe a car had gone off the road during the night. That happened once before at the same spot. A driver missed the curve and ended up nose first in the creek. If a vehicle had rolled under the bridge, its lights might have been shining upward. I put the truck in reverse and backed onto the shoulder. The radio was quiet. Dispatch had not mentioned an accident. I picked up the handset and called in my location, but all I got was static. That was not unusual near Mercer Creek. The road dipped between 2 wooded ridges, and county radios cut out there all the time. I took my flashlight from behind the seat and got out. There was no traffic, no wind either. The fog moved slowly over the pavement, and I could hear the creek running below. I walked to the railing and looked down. The light was not under the bridge. It was hovering above it. From where I stood, I could only see the lower part of it because it hung a few feet beyond the south side of the bridge, almost level with the road. It looked round at first, but the fog made the edges hard to judge. It seemed about the size of a compact car. The whole underside gave off a dull white glow. There were no beams, no blinking lights, and no sound. I leaned over the railing, expecting to hear an engine or propellers. I heard water, my truck idling, and a clicking noise from the hot exhaust pipe. Nothing else. The object was close enough that I should have felt air moving if it had been a helicopter or drone. The fog around it stayed smooth. It did not swirl or blow away. I stood there longer than I should have. I had been with county roads for 14 years. I had seen weather balloons, utility helicopters, crop planes, military jets, and every kind of homemade drone people could buy. This did not resemble any of them. The shape became clearer when the fog thinned for a moment. It was not round. It was wider than it was tall, with a flat lower surface and a curved top. The glow came from the bottom, but it had no visible lamps. The upper part was dark, almost the same color as the sky. I could not see windows, markings, seams, or anything that told me what it was made of. It stayed completely still. I raised my flashlight and pointed it at the object. The beam looked weak next to the glow, but it reached the side. For a second, I saw a surface that looked gray and smooth. Then my flashlight dimmed. I clicked it off and on. The bulb came back, then faded again. Behind me, the truck engine changed pitch. I turned around. The headlights had gone dim, and the dashboard lights pulsed slowly, bright to dark, bright to dark. The engine kept running, but it sounded rough, like it was about to stall. I walked back toward the cab. Halfway there, I heard a low vibration. I did not hear it through my ears exactly. I felt it in my jaw and the center of my chest. It reminded me of standing near a large electrical transformer, except deeper. The metal railing under my hand started to hum. I let go of it. The vibration stopped. I looked back over the bridge. The object had moved. It was now directly above the center of the road, maybe 15 feet over the pavement. I had not seen it cross from the side. It had simply been in one place, and then it was in another. The glow spread across the bridge deck. Every crack in the concrete became visible. The white edge lines looked almost blue. My truck cast a shadow behind it, but the shadow had two faint outlines, like the light came from more than one direction. I did not see anyone inside the object. I did not see anything standing near it. I kept telling myself there had to be a normal explanation, but I could not come up with one that fit what I was looking at. I climbed into the truck and shut the door. The radio came alive with a burst of voices. Several people seemed to be talking at once, but the words were stretched and broken. I heard my name once. At least I thought I did. Caleb, copy? Then static swallowed it. I grabbed the handset. This is Caleb. I'm at Mercer Creek. There's something over the bridge. The radio made a sharp clicking sound. A voice replied, but it was too slow and low to understand. It sounded like a recording played at the wrong speed. The truck engine stalled. Everything went quiet. The headlights shut off. The dashboard went black. Even the little digital clock disappeared. The object remained above the bridge. I locked the doors, which felt stupid because I did not know what I was locking them against. I tried the ignition. Nothing happened. The starter did not click. The glow from the object reached into the cab. It was not bright enough to hurt my eyes, but it made every surface look flat and gray. I could see dust on the dashboard and small cracks in the steering wheel. Then I noticed movement near the far end of the bridge. Something stood beside the guardrail. I could not tell if it was a person. It was tall and narrow, but the fog cut off the lower half. It did not reflect the light the way a person in work clothes would have. It looked darker than everything around it, like a vertical gap. I stared at it for several seconds. It leaned slightly toward the truck. I reached behind the seat for the emergency flare gun. We carried it for road closures and accidents. My hand closed around the plastic grip, but I did not pull it out. I did not want to point anything at whatever was there. The dark shape remained by the rail. Another shape appeared on the opposite side of the road. I was sure it had not walked there. One moment, the second guardrail was empty. The next, something stood beside it. Both shapes faced the truck. They did not move closer. I looked down at the ignition and tried the key again. The dashboard flickered. The clock came on long enough to show 4:52, then went blank. When I looked up, the bridge was empty. The dark shapes were gone. The object was still there, but the glow had weakened. Its outline became harder to see in the fog. A sound came from the roof of the truck. It was a soft tapping, 3 slow taps near the passenger side. I held my breath. 3 more taps followed, farther back. They were not loud. They sounded like someone touching the roof with one finger while walking along the truck bed. The tapping moved behind me, then stopped. I looked into the side mirror. I saw the white body of the maintenance truck, the yellow warning light on top, and fog along the shoulder. Nothing stood behind me. The engine started by itself. The key was still turned forward, but I had not touched it again. The dashboard lights returned. The radio came on at full volume with a blast of static. The object rose. It did not tilt or rotate. It moved straight up, slowly at first. As it climbed, the glow under it became smaller and more concentrated. The fog below it pulled upward in thin strands, though I still felt no wind. It stopped about 100 feet over the bridge. A red light appeared on one side. That was the first part of it that looked familiar. For half a second, I thought it might be an aircraft after all. Then the red light moved across the surface without the object turning. It slid from one edge to the other, disappeared, and appeared again underneath. The low vibration returned. My teeth hurt. The truck radio stopped producing static and went completely silent. The screen displayed numbers I had never seen before. They changed too quickly to read, then settled on 00.0. The object moved north, following the road. It passed over my truck without making a sound. I ducked, even though it was high above me. The inside of the cab darkened as it crossed overhead. For 1 second, the heater blew air that smelled like wet metal and burned dust. Then the object continued along Route 18. It did not fly away quickly. It drifted above the center line at maybe 20 miles per hour, keeping the same height. The glow beneath it lit the treetops as it moved through the fog. I watched until the road curved behind the ridge. The radio came back. Caleb, copy? Caleb, what's your status? It was Denise at dispatch. Her voice sounded normal. I answered, but my mouth felt numb. I'm here. You dropped off. Are you at Mercer? Yes. Did you clear the bridge? I looked at the dashboard clock. It showed 5:37. I thought the clock had reset. I checked my phone, but it showed the same time. 45 minutes had passed since I first stopped. It had not felt like 45 minutes. Maybe 10, 15 at the most. Denise asked if I needed help. I almost told her everything. Instead, I said the truck had stalled and the radio had cut out. She told me to inspect the bridge and continue north if it was safe. I sat there for a while before I got out. The sky had started turning gray. The fog still covered the creek, but the bridge looked normal. I checked the road surface, the railings, and the concrete supports as best I could. I expected scorch marks, or cracks. I found nothing. There was one thing near the center line. A patch of pavement about 3 feet across was warm. I felt it through my gloves at first, then took one glove off and touched the road. The asphalt was noticeably warmer than the pavement around it. There was no discoloration, and the surface was dry even though the rest of the bridge was damp from fog. I marked the location with yellow paint because I did not know what else to do. Then I drove north. The truck worked normally for the rest of the morning. I finished clearing branches near Hensley Road and returned to the maintenance depot just after noon. I told my supervisor, Roy Maddox, that I had seen an unidentified object over Mercer Creek. I kept the details basic. I mentioned the light, the engine trouble, and the time gap. I did not mention the shapes beside the guardrails or the tapping on the roof. Roy listened without making jokes, which surprised me. He asked if I had been tired. I said yes, but not enough to imagine something that blocked the road. We checked the truck in the shop. The battery tested fine. The alternator was fine. The radio had no stored faults. The roof had 3 shallow dents above the passenger side, each about the size of a coin. Roy said they were probably old. I knew they were not. I washed that truck every Friday. The next morning, Roy and I inspected the bridge in daylight. The yellow paint mark was still there. The warm patch had cooled. We found no damage to the deck or railings. The concrete supports looked normal. There were no tire tracks on the bank, no broken branches, and no footprints in the mud below. Roy stood under the bridge for a long time, looking up at the beams. He asked where the object had hovered. I pointed to the center span. He nodded and wrote something in his notebook. For the next 2 days, nobody mentioned it. On Thursday morning, 3 days after the incident, 2 men came to the maintenance depot. I was in the break room when Trina from the front office called me over the radio and asked if I could come up front. She said some contractors had questions about Mercer Creek. The men stood near the counter. Both wore dark gray jackets, plain trousers, and clean black shoes. They looked to be in their 40s. One was tall and thin with short brown hair. The other was heavier, with a round face and a pale scar along his chin. They did not introduce themselves. The taller man asked if I was the employee who had inspected the bridge before sunrise on Monday. I said I was. He asked whether I had repaired anything. I said no. The heavier man asked, "No surface work?" "No." "No electrical work?" "There's no electrical equipment on that bridge." He looked at the taller man. The taller man asked if we had replaced any bolts, plates, concrete sections, drainage grates, or guardrail hardware. I told him nothing had been damaged. Both men relaxed. It was a small change, but I noticed it. The taller man's shoulders dropped. The heavier man smiled slightly. "Good," he said. I asked who they worked for. The taller man looked toward the window before answering. "We're checking infrastructure reports." "What agency?" He ignored that and asked if the bridge had been closed at any point after my inspection. I said it had stayed open. He asked if anyone had taken samples from the road. I told him no. Again, the 2 men exchanged a look. The heavier one said, "Then there shouldn't be any issue." I asked what kind of issue he meant. Neither answered. Trina asked whether they had identification or paperwork. The taller man reached into his jacket, but instead of showing a badge, he took out a small folded card. He glanced at it, put it away, and said they had all the information they needed. They left through the front door. I followed them outside because I wanted to see their vehicle. The parking lot was empty except for county trucks, Trina's sedan, and my pickup. The two men walked around the side of the building. I was only a few seconds behind them, but when I reached the corner, they were gone. There was a chain link fence along that side and a locked equipment yard beyond it. The nearest road was more than 100 yards away. I checked behind the salt shed and around the fuel tanks. I did not find them. When I went back inside, Trina asked where they had parked. I said I did not know. She looked through the visitor log. They had not signed in. Roy came out of his office after hearing us talk. I told him what the men had asked. He went quiet when I mentioned the questions about repairs. Then he opened his notebook from Tuesday. On the page where he had written the bridge inspection, there was a line neither of us remembered adding. It was written in block letters at the bottom of the page. No correction required. Roy stared at it, then tore the page out and locked it in his desk. That afternoon, I drove past Mercer Creek on my way home. The yellow paint mark I had made was gone. The road had not been resurfaced. The paint had not faded or washed away. The pavement, where it had been, looked slightly newer than the rest of the bridge, like a square section had been replaced and matched as closely as possible. I stopped on the shoulder and walked back. The square was cold and dry. Near the edge, just inside the white line, I found 3 shallow, round marks pressed into the asphalt. They were spaced evenly apart. I stood there until a truck came around the curve and honked at me. Then I went back to my pickup and drove home. The black sedan pulled into the motel lot at 11:42 on the first Thursday of every month. I only noticed the pattern because it always stopped outside room 12. I owned the Blue Mesa Motor Lodge in Grants, New Mexico. It was a small place off Route 66, 20 rooms in a U shape around a cracked parking lot with a laundromat on one side and a closed diner on the other. My wife Elaine handled the books and I worked the front desk most evenings. We lived in a little apartment behind the office. The sedan first showed up in February. It was an older black car, long and low, maybe a Lincoln or Cadillac. I was bad with models. It had dark windows and no front plate. That was not unusual in New Mexico, but the rear plate looked strange. It was pale gray with no visible letters from where I sat. The car came in from the west entrance, moved slowly past the office, and stopped directly in front of room 12. No one got out. The engine stayed running for about 8 minutes. Then the headlights turned off, came back on, and the car left the same way it came. Room 12 was empty. I thought it was someone checking an address or waiting for a guest. Motel parking lots attracted all kinds of people, so I did not give it much thought. The next month, it happened again. First Thursday, 11:42 at night, the car stopped in the same spot. This time, room 12 was occupied by a traveling nurse named Sadie Lynn. She had checked in around 7 and gone straight to bed. Her car was parked 2 spaces away. I watched the sedan through the office window. The engine idled, but the exhaust looked wrong. It was a cold night, and I could see vapor from every vehicle that passed on the road. The sedan had none. I stepped outside. The air smelled like snow, even though the sky was clear. The motel sign buzzed above me, and somewhere behind the building, a loose piece of sheet metal tapped in the wind. As soon as I reached the edge of the walkway, the sedan's headlights shut off. The car sat there in darkness. I could not see anyone inside. I called out, "Can I help you?" No response. I walked closer. The windshield reflected the motel lights, but I could make out 2 shapes in the front seats, one in the driver's seat and one on the passenger side. Neither moved. I stopped about 20 feet away. The passenger shape seemed too tall. Its head was close to the roof, and the shoulders looked narrow. I told myself it was the seat back or a coat hanging from the headrest. Then the brake lights came on. The car rolled backward without the engine changing sound. It reversed all the way to the entrance, turned, and drove off. Sadie came into the office the next morning and asked if anyone had knocked on her door during the night. I said I had not seen anyone get out of the car. She frowned and said she had heard 3 knocks around midnight. Slow knocks, spaced far apart. She had looked through the curtain and seen the black sedan. I asked whether she saw the driver. She said no. Then she asked if the motel had an ice machine behind room 12 because she had heard a low humming through the wall. There was no ice machine on that side of the building. I checked the room after she left. Nothing looked damaged. The television worked, the lights worked, and the plumbing was normal. But the digital clock on the nightstand had stopped at 11:42. I replaced it. In April, the sedan returned. Same day, same time. Room 12 was empty again. I had started expecting it, so I wrote down the details. The car arrived at 11:42, stayed for 8 minutes, and left at 11:50. The passenger side window lowered about 2 inches while it sat there. I heard the humming Sadie had mentioned. It was low and steady, not loud enough to be an engine. It seemed to come from the room more than the car. I went inside room 12 after the sedan left. The humming stopped as soon as I opened the door. The new clock showed 11:42 even though it was almost midnight. I unplugged it. The numbers stayed lit for another 10 seconds. That bothered me more than the car. I told Elaine about the pattern. She said I was paying too much attention to it. She thought it might be someone having an affair or a private investigator checking whether a certain car was parked there. I pointed out that no one ever got out. She said maybe they did not need to. That answer made sense until May. A thunderstorm came through that night. Heavy rain, strong wind, and lightning over Mount Taylor. The parking lot flooded near the east drain. At 11:42, the black sedan arrived. The rain had been coming down hard enough that I could barely see the road, but the car looked dry. Water ran across the pavement around its tires. The hood and roof did not shine with rain. The windshield wipers were not moving. It stopped outside room 12. That night, a couple from Arizona was staying there. Their names were Kevin and Marla Soto. They had been arguing when they checked in, then quieted down around 10. At 11:45, Marla called the office. Her voice was low. She asked if I had sent someone to stand outside their bathroom window. Room 12 did not have a bathroom window. I told her to stay inside. I grabbed the flashlight and the old revolver I kept under the counter, though I left the gun in my waistband. Elaine called the police while I crossed the lot. The sedan was still there. I could see the two shapes in the front seats. This time, there was a third shape in the back. I knocked on room 12. Kevin opened the door almost immediately. He looked angry and scared. Marla stood behind him, holding a towel around her shoulders. She said something had moved along the wall inside the bathroom, not a shadow from outside. She said it looked like the shape of a person passing behind the wall. I checked the bathroom. There was nothing unusual except a dark line near the ceiling. It looked like water damage, but when I touched it, the paint was warm. Kevin asked about the car outside. I turned toward the window. The sedan was gone. It had left without me hearing it. The police arrived 9 minutes later. They searched the property and found nobody. One officer, Deputy Luis Romero, asked to see the security footage. The Blue Mesa had 4 cameras. One covered the office entrance, one covered the west side, and 2 watched the parking lot. The system was old, but it usually worked. The sedan appeared on the west camera at 11:42. It moved into the lot. Then the footage from all 4 cameras skipped ahead to 11:51. The storm continued normally in the recording. Rain moved across the screen and lightning flashed. The time code advanced 1 second at a time. But the sedan was gone from every frame after it passed the office. Deputy Romero watched the clip twice. He asked whether I had another recording system. I said no. He wrote down the make of the cameras, then asked how long I had owned the motel. 6 years, I said. He looked toward room 12. Anything happened there before? Not that I know of. He told me to call if the car returned. It did return. June, July, August. Always the first Thursday. Always 11:42. In June, room 12's telephone rang while the room was vacant. When I answered from the office, I heard static and a faint sound like someone breathing through their nose. In July, every light in the room turned on at once when the sedan arrived. In August, a guest in room 11 complained that someone was walking back and forth in room 12. That room was empty and locked. I started keeping room 12 vacant on the first Thursday of each month. I did not tell Elaine at first. I just marked it unavailable in the system. She noticed in September. She said we could not afford to leave rooms empty because of a car that never caused any real damage. I tried to explain that it was not only the car. The clock kept stopping. The phone rang with no line connected. Guests heard knocks and humming. The cameras lost time. Elaine listened, then said, "Sell it to someone for one night and sleep in there yourself." I knew she meant it as a challenge, so I did. On the first Thursday in October, I locked the office at 11 and carried a chair into room 12. I left the curtains open just enough to see the parking space. I brought a flashlight, my phone, the revolver, and a battery-powered clock. The room smelled faintly of bleach. I checked the bathroom, under the bed, behind the curtains, and inside the closet. Everything was normal. At 11:36, the television turned on. The screen showed gray static. I unplugged it. The static remained for several seconds before the screen went black. At 11:39, I heard someone walking on the roof. Slow steps moved from the office side toward room 12. The motel roof was flat and hard to reach without a ladder. The steps stopped directly above me. I called Elaine and told her to stay in the apartment. At 11:41, the battery clock on the nightstand began losing numbers. First, the last digit disappeared, then part of the 7. By 11:42, the display was blank. The sedan entered the lot. It rolled past the office and stopped outside the room. Up close, it looked older than I had thought. The paint was dull, and the chrome around the windows had small dark spots. The tires were clean. The windows were black. I could not see the shapes inside. The humming started. It came through the floor. The chair vibrated under me. The glass of water on the table formed small rings even though nothing touched it. Then someone knocked on the door, 3 times, slow and even. I held the revolver but kept it pointed down. "Who is it?" No one answered. I looked through the curtain. The sedan remained closed. No one stood on the walkway. The bathroom door moved behind me. It opened about an inch. I knew I had shut it. I crossed the room and pushed it closed. The humming stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard a voice from the bathroom. It sounded like a man speaking from far away. I could not understand the words at first. I leaned closer. The voice said a name, Dennis Vale. It repeated the name twice. I opened the bathroom door. The room was empty. The mirror had fogged over even though there was no hot water running. Someone had drawn a vertical line down the center of the glass. Behind me, the motel room door clicked. I turned. The deadbolt had unlocked itself. The handle began to move down. I stepped backward and raised the revolver. The door opened 2 inches and stopped against the security chain. Through the gap, I saw the black sedan. The rear passenger window was open. A pale shape sat behind it. I could not see a face. It looked like the side of a head turned toward the room. The chain pulled tight. The door moved another half inch. I shouted that I had a gun. The pressure stopped. The sedan's headlights came on. The room filled with white light. For several seconds, I saw shadows moving across the walls behind me. Tall, narrow shadows, more than 2 of them, even though I was the only person in the room. Then every light went out. The humming ended. The door slammed shut. When the electricity returned, the sedan was gone. My phone said 12:07. I had lost 25 minutes. Elaine was pounding on the outside door. She said she had tried calling me for almost half an hour. I unlocked the chain and let her in. She looked at the revolver in my hand and asked what had happened. Before I could answer, she pointed at the bathroom mirror. The name Dennis Vale had been written in the fog. The next morning, I searched the old motel records. The previous owner had left boxes of receipts and registration cards in a storage room behind the laundry. Most were useless. Some had water damage, and others had faded until the writing was almost gone. I found a registration card from 15 years earlier. Dennis Vale had stayed in room 12 on October 4th. The address listed was in Flagstaff, Arizona. The phone number had been disconnected. Under vehicle information, he had written black sedan. I called the former owner, a man named Hugh Bell, who lived in Albuquerque. He was quiet when I mentioned Dennis. Then he asked why I was looking. I told him about the car. Hugh said he had only seen Dennis once. He had checked in late, paid cash, and asked for room 12 even though several other rooms were open. The next morning, the bed had not been slept in. Dennis had left behind one item, a motel key from a different place. Hugh said the key had the number 12 on it. I asked whether Dennis had returned. Hugh said no. Then he added, other people came asking. What people? 2 men, a few weeks later. He could not remember their names. They asked what time Dennis arrived, what room he used, and whether his car had parked directly outside the door. I asked what they looked like. Hugh said one was tall and thin. The other had a wide face and very light eyebrows. That evening, just before 7, 2 men came into the office. It was windy and cold outside. Dust moved across the lot in low sheets. The first man was tall and thin, maybe 50, with dark hair combed straight back. The second had a broad face and pale eyebrows that were almost invisible. Neither wore a coat. The taller man asked if I was the owner. I said yes. He placed an old photograph on the counter. It showed the Blue Mesa parking lot, but the motel sign had a different name. The photo looked at least 20 years old. Room 12 was visible in the background. A black sedan sat outside it. The taller man asked who occupied that room on October 4th, 15 years ago. I did not answer right away. The broad-faced man looked toward the wall clock. It was 7:03. He asked again. I said I did not give out guest information. The taller man smiled a little. That information is no longer private. I asked who they worked for. He said they were handling an old property matter. I asked whether they knew Dennis Vale. Neither reacted to the name. The broad-faced man asked what time Dennis had checked in. I said I did not know. Was the sedan already here? I don't know. Did he enter the room? I wasn't the owner then. The taller man looked disappointed. Then he asked something I was not expecting. Did the room recognize him? I thought I had misheard. Did the room what? He stared at me. The broad-faced man touched his arm. The taller man changed the question. Was anything repaired afterward? No. Walls? Wiring? Plumbing? No. Mirror? I felt my throat tighten. I asked why the mirror mattered. The 2 men looked at each other. The broad-faced man said, then it remained in place. Neither of them asked to see the old registration card. They did not ask whether I had records, footage, or contact information. The taller man picked up the photograph. Before leaving, he asked whether room 12 was occupied that night. I said no. He nodded as if that was the correct answer. They walked outside. A black sedan waited near the road. It was the same one that came every month. The rear passenger door was open. The 2 men did not get into the front seats. Both climbed into the back. The door closed. The car drove away. I locked room 12 that night and stayed in the apartment with Elaine. At 11:42, the phone in the office rang. The caller ID showed room 12. I let it ring 6 times before answering. There was no static. A man spoke clearly. He said, Dennis Vale checked out. Then the line went dead. I looked through the office window. The black sedan was parked outside room 12. Its headlights were off. The driver's door stood open. No one was inside. At 11:50, the interior light went out. The door closed by itself. The sedan backed away from the room and left the parking lot. It did not return the next month. Room 12 stayed empty for 3 more Thursdays. After that, Elaine convinced me to rent it again. The first guest was a retired teacher named Gloria Rains. She stayed one night and checked out early. She said the room was fine, except for the bathroom mirror. I asked what was wrong with it. Gloria said there was a name scratched into the glass. It only appeared when the mirror fogged. I went in after she left and ran the shower. The glass slowly clouded. A few letters appeared near the bottom, faint but readable. It did not say Dennis Vale. It said my name. The envelope was sitting on my desk when I came back from lunch. It had no stamp, no return address, and no name written on the front. It was made of thick brown paper and sealed with clear tape along every edge. Someone had left it on top of the morning mail, directly beside my keyboard. I ran the weekly newspaper in a small town in southern Minnesota called Bellwether. The paper was called the Bellwether County Record, and our office was on Main Street between a pharmacy and an insurance agency. There were 5 of us working there, counting me. That afternoon in January was bitterly cold. The temperature had dropped below 0 before sunrise, and wind pushed loose snow across the street in thin sheets. Schools had closed early. Most businesses were empty. I asked Linda at the front desk who had delivered the envelope. She said she had not seen anyone bring it in. Our front door made a loud electronic chime whenever it opened. Linda had been at her desk all morning, except for a quick bathroom break around 11. She said the envelope had not been there before I left for lunch. I carried it into the back office. My name was Aaron Vale. I had been editor for 7 years, and anonymous packages were not completely unusual. People sent us copies of court documents, photos of damaged roads, complaints about neighbors, and handwritten claims about local officials. The tape on this envelope was different. It had been wrapped around all 4 sides several times, as if the sender did not want air getting inside. I used a letter opener to cut one end. There was no note. Inside were 12 photographs and a folded county road map. The pictures had been printed on glossy paper, the kind people used at home. Each showed farmland at night, bare fields, grain bins, fence lines, and a distant row of trees. The images were dark and grainy, but several bright objects were visible above the fields. At first, I assumed they were reflections or aircraft lights. Then I looked closer. The objects appeared in different positions from one photo to the next. Some looked like white points. Others were wider, almost rectangular. In 3 pictures, a pale glow lit the ground beneath them. There were no headlights, no visible roads, and no buildings nearby. The final photograph showed a dark field covered with snow. A bright shape hung above a line of cottonwoods. It was low enough that the tops of the trees were lit from above. Something stood near the bottom edge of the frame. It looked like a person facing the camera. I took the photographs into the newsroom. Our reporter, Jenna Ortiz, was working on a school board story. Our photographer, Miles Brenner, was editing pictures from a basketball game. I showed Miles the first 3 images. He held them under his desk lamp and said they looked like long exposures. He thought the white objects could be farm equipment, airplanes, or lights on distant towers made larger by camera movement. Then he reached the last photograph. He stopped talking. "What?" I asked. He pointed at the figure near the bottom. "That wasn't caused by camera shake." Jenna came over and looked. She said it might have been the photographer's shadow. Miles shook his head. The light source was behind the figure, not behind the camera. A shadow should have stretched toward us. This shape stood upright and cast no visible shadow at all. I unfolded the road map. A circle had been drawn in pencil around an area west of Bellwether near County Road 6. There were no towns there, only farms and drainage ditches. A smaller mark had been placed near an abandoned rail crossing. Someone had written a time beside it, 2:36 a.m. There was no date. Linda called from the front desk and said the office phone was ringing, but every time she answered, the line went silent. A moment later, my phone rang. I picked it up. No one spoke. I heard a steady low sound, almost like wind moving through a narrow pipe. Then a man said, "Did you open it?" His voice was calm and close. I asked who was calling. The line went dead. I checked the caller ID. It showed our own office number. I told the others it was probably someone trying to scare us. I did not believe that, but I wanted the room to feel normal again. We examined the photographs one at a time. There were small details that made them harder to dismiss. In one, cattle stood pressed against the far side of a pen, all facing away from the light. In another, a farmhouse porch light was on, but the windows were dark. A photo taken near a frozen pond showed a bright reflection in the ice, though the object above it was not visible in the sky. The paper felt cold, not cool from being outside. Cold enough that moisture formed on the surface when we held it under the warm office lights. Miles checked the image files with a magnifying lens and said they had been printed from low-resolution digital pictures. There were faint lines across all of them, as though they had been copied from a video. Jenna wanted to drive to the marked location before dark. I said no. Snow was starting again, and the county had issued a travel warning. County Road 6 crossed open farmland where drifts formed quickly. We could go in the morning. I placed the photos and map back in the envelope and locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk. At 4, the lights in the office dimmed. They did not go out. They faded slowly over several seconds, then returned to normal. The printer started by itself. A blank sheet came out. Then another. The third page had a gray rectangle printed in the center. It looked like a blurred copy of one of the photographs. Miles opened the printer queue on his computer. There were no jobs listed. The machine printed one more page. This one showed a dark field with a white point over it. At the bottom, barely visible, was part of a face. Only the forehead and eyes appeared above the edge of the image. Jenna unplugged the printer. We all stood there looking at the page. The eyes were wide apart and very dark. The skin around them looked smooth, but the image was too poor to make out anything else. I folded the page in half and put it in the envelope. At 5, we closed the office. Miles offered to stay with me, but I told everyone to go home before the roads got worse. I had payroll to finish and lived only 4 blocks away. By 6, Main Street was almost empty. Snow moved sideways past the windows. The pharmacy sign across the street flickered on and off. I could hear the furnace in the basement and the occasional pop of the building settling in the cold. I tried calling the sheriff's office. I knew Deputy Mark Halverson from covering county meetings. I told him about the package and the phone call. He asked whether the photos showed a crime. I said I did not know. He told me not to touch the envelope again and said he would stop by in the morning if the weather allowed. While I was talking to him, someone knocked on the back door. The back entrance opened into an alley behind the building. We kept it locked, and visitors always used the front. I stopped speaking. Mark asked what was wrong. There were 3 more knocks, slow and evenly spaced. I told him someone was at the back door. He said not to open it. I walked through the dark press room and looked through the small window. No one stood outside. The alley was full of blowing snow. The security light above the door had gone out. I returned to my desk. The bottom drawer was open. I had locked it. The envelope sat on my chair. I checked the office. The front door was locked. The bathroom was empty. The basement door was still bolted from our side. The phone rang again. I answered without speaking. The same low sound came through the receiver. Then the voice said, "How many handled it?" I asked what he meant. "How many touched the photographs?" I hung up. The desk clock showed 6:18. My computer clock showed 6:41. I checked my phone. It was 6:41. I had lost 23 minutes. I did not remember sitting down or moving away from the phone. I was standing beside the filing cabinet with the envelope under one arm. The office felt colder. My breath was visible. I put on my coat, grabbed the envelope, and decided to leave. As I reached the front door, I saw lights moving across the buildings opposite the street. They were white and silent. At first, I thought a snowplow was coming around the corner. The glow passed over the pharmacy windows, then moved upward across the brick wall. I looked outside. A bright object hovered above the intersection. The snow made its shape hard to see. It appeared flat and broad, with a pale light underneath. It was lower than the rooftops and moved slowly against the wind. No sound came from it. The traffic light at the intersection went dark. The object stopped. For several seconds, it remained above the middle of the street. Then every phone in the office rang at once. The front desk phone, my desk phone, the fax line, and an old extension in the press room. I backed away from the window. The ringing stopped together. Outside, the object moved east between the buildings and disappeared into the snow. The traffic light came back on. I left through the front door and locked it behind me. The walk home took less than 10 minutes, but I kept hearing footsteps behind me. Each time I turned, the sidewalk was empty. Snow covered my tracks within seconds. When I reached my house, my wife, Beth, was standing at the kitchen window. She asked why I had been parked across the street for half an hour. I told her I had walked home. She pointed outside. A dark sedan sat near the corner with its lights off. As we watched, it pulled away from the curb and drove slowly past the house. I could not see the driver. I kept the envelope in the garage overnight. I placed it inside a metal toolbox and locked the lid. At 3:12 in the morning, something struck the garage door. The sound was heavy enough to wake both of us. I looked through the bedroom window. The driveway was empty. A pale light moved behind the garage, brightening the snow for a few seconds before fading. I did not go outside. The next morning was clear and brutally cold. The temperature was 15 below zero, and the wind had eased. I reached the newspaper office around 8. 2 men were waiting on the sidewalk. Neither wore a coat. They had on dark trousers, white shirts, and thin black ties. One was tall with short gray hair. The other was younger, maybe 35, with pale skin and a narrow face. Their shoes were clean and dry despite the snow. The older man smiled and said, "Mr. Vale?" I asked who they were. He said they were following up on material delivered to the newspaper. I asked what agency they worked for. He gave the name of a regional postal inspection office. I had dealt with postal inspectors before, and the title he used did not sound right. The younger man asked whether I had opened the envelope. I said yes. Did anyone else handle it? I asked why that mattered. He repeated the question. I said several employees had seen the photographs. Seen or handled? Both. The older man looked disappointed. How many? 3, counting me. He asked whether anyone had taken a photograph of the photographs. I said no. Were any copies made? I thought about the pages from the printer. I told him I did not know. The 2 men looked at each other. And with the younger one asked where the envelope was. I said it was safe. He did not ask me to give it to him. Neither man asked to see the photographs. They only wanted to know who had touched them. The older man asked whether the envelope had been opened inside the building. I said yes. Near a window? I don't remember. Was it exposed to outside air? I told him it was an envelope, not evidence from a laboratory. He smiled again, but his eyes did not change. The younger man asked if I had unfolded the map. I said I had. Did you recognize the marked location? County Road 6. That is not the marked location. I asked what he meant. He looked toward the courthouse clock at the end of Main Street. It only appeared that way. I unlocked the front door but did not invite them inside. The older man asked whether anyone had visited the site. I said no. He nodded. Good. The younger man asked if I had seen any light after opening the envelope. I did not answer. He watched my face for several seconds. Then he said, "It moved?" I asked how he knew. The older man touched his arm. The younger man stepped back. The older man thanked me for my time and said someone might contact me again. I asked for identification. He took a black wallet from his pocket and opened it briefly. The card inside had no photograph that I could see. It was printed with a circular seal and several lines of small text. I asked for their names. He said, Mr. Lane. The younger man said nothing. Then they walked west along Main Street. They had no hats, gloves, or coats. Their sleeves moved in the wind, but neither appeared cold. I watched them until a delivery truck passed between us. When it cleared, the sidewalk was empty. There were no doors nearby they could have entered. I checked the snow. Their footprints ended in the middle of the block. Linda arrived a few minutes later. She asked why I was standing outside without gloves. I told her about the men. She said 2 people matching that description had been inside the office the day before. She remembered them because they had stood near my desk while I was at lunch. I asked why she had said no one delivered the envelope. She looked confused. Then she said she had not seen an envelope. She only remembered the men asking which desk belonged to the editor. Inside, I unlocked my desk drawer. The envelope was there. I had left it in the locked toolbox at home. The tape had been replaced. The photographs were inside, but the last image had changed. The figure in the field was gone. In its place was a dark sedan parked beside the newspaper office. 3 people stood near the front window, Miles, Jenna, and me. The picture had been taken from above the intersection during the snowstorm. Behind us, inside the office, 2 tall shapes stood near my desk. At the bottom of the photograph, someone had written a time in pencil. 8:14 a.m. I looked at the clock. It was 8:13. A car door closed outside. I found the scorch marks on the 3rd day after I pulled up the last row of pine boards in front of the altar. The church had been abandoned since the late 90s. It sat outside a small town called Afton in northern Maine, at the end of a gravel road that narrowed into woods. The building was white clapboard with a short bell tower, 12 narrow windows, and a cemetery behind it. Most of the headstones were from the 1800s. A couple from Portland had bought the property and planned to turn it into a wedding venue. I was hired to repair the floor, replace some rotten wall framing, and rebuild the front steps. I worked alone most days. My name was Nathan Crowley. I had been doing carpentry for 22 years. Old buildings always had surprises. Rot, mice, bad wiring, repairs done by somebody's uncle with whatever nails he had in his pocket. I expected problems. I did not expect the black circles. There were 7 of them under the floorboard, spread across the original subfloor in a rough curve. Each was about 2 feet wide. The wood inside the circles was dark and cracked, like it had been exposed to intense heat, but the surrounding boards were untouched. At first I thought they came from old wood stoves. That made no sense once I looked closer. There had never been stoves in those positions. The circles ran from the center aisle toward the northeast corner where the old choir seats had been. I scraped one with a chisel. The burned layer was thin. Under it, the wood was solid. The strange part was the smell. It was not like smoke or ash. It smelled metallic, almost like hot coins or the inside of an old electrical panel. The odor became stronger when I disturbed the surface. I opened the windows and kept working. Around noon, I heard someone walk across the porch. I expected the owners, Martin and Elise, but nobody came through the door. The steps moved from one side of the porch to the other, slow and heavy. I called out. No answer. I walked outside. The porch was empty. The gravel drive was empty too. My truck was the only vehicle there. The nearest house was over a mile away. I checked around the building and found nothing except my own footprints in the damp grass. The weather had been cold and wet all week. Low clouds, light rain, and fog in the mornings. The woods around the church stayed dark even in the afternoon. I went back inside and noticed the smell had spread. It was strongest near the 7 circles, but I could detect it all the way to the entrance. I took pictures and sent them to Martin. He called 10 minutes later. He said he had never heard of a fire inside the church. His realtor had told him the building closed because the congregation became too small to maintain it. I asked if there had been lightning damage. He did not know. He said I could replace any burned boards that seemed unsafe. I told him the boards were structurally fine. The marks looked worse than they were. That evening, before I left, I covered the exposed section with plastic sheeting and set my tools on top to hold it down. The next morning, the plastic had been folded into a neat square. My tools were lined up beside it. I stood in the doorway for a while, trying to remember if I had done that myself. I knew I had not. The front door had been locked when I arrived. The side door was nailed shut from the inside, and most of the windows had paint sealing them to the frames. Nothing was missing. I checked the building for signs of someone sleeping there. No food, clothing, bedding, or fresh footprints. The basement was empty except for an oil tank and a pile of broken chairs. I blamed Martin. I thought maybe he had come by early, moved everything, and left. He denied it. He was in Portland. I started measuring the burned areas. The 7 circles were almost identical in size. The distance between them was not equal, but each one sat exactly between floor joists. None crossed over a joist, even though the circles appeared older than the current floor supports. That suggested somebody had made them after the framing was installed. But there were no tool marks. The edges were too clean to be accidental and too uneven to be cut. I spent most of that day removing damaged trim and replacing boards near the south wall. Nothing else happened until around 4. I heard the bell. It gave one soft strike above me. The rope had been removed years ago. I climbed the narrow ladder into the bell tower. The bell was still there, green with age and covered in dust. A wooden wheel held it in place. The bell was too heavy to move by hand, and there was no wind inside the tower. On the dusty platform beneath it were 3 fresh marks. They looked like narrow footprints, but they did not have toes or heels. Each mark was long and oval, about 14 inches from end to end. They led toward the corner and stopped at the wall. I took another picture. My phone shut off as soon as I pressed the button. The battery had been at 60%. I brought it back downstairs and plugged it into a charger connected to my generator. It turned on, but the photo from the bell tower was gone. That night, I dreamed about the church. I normally did not remember dreams, but this one felt plain and specific. I was standing outside in deep snow. All the windows glowed white. I could see several people inside, lined up in the center aisle and facing the altar. None of them moved. Above the roof, something bright hung in the sky. I woke at 3:06 in the morning because my phone was ringing. The screen showed the church owner's number. I answered. No one spoke. There was a low hum on the line and a faint clicking sound that repeated every few seconds. Then a man said, "Did you open the floor?" I thought it was Martin, but the voice was different, older and very calm. I asked who was calling. The line disconnected. When I checked the call history, there was no incoming call. The next morning, Martin said he had been asleep and had not contacted me. I considered quitting the job. Instead, I asked Elise if she could find any records about the church. She worked in a law office and had access to old property files. She called later that afternoon. The church had been built in 1911 after an earlier church burned down on the same site. The fire started during a winter service. Everyone got out safely, but the building was destroyed. The official report blamed a defective furnace. I asked where the furnace had been. She said the basement near the west wall. The black circles were on the east side. She also found a newspaper article from 1974 about unusual lights reported over Afton. Several residents said a bright object had hovered above the church during an evening storm. The article treated it like a weather event and quoted someone from the Air Force saying it was probably reflected lightning. The church closed for repairs for 6 weeks after that. The records did not say what had been repaired. That afternoon, while I worked near the altar, I heard voices outside. 2 men were standing in the doorway. I had not heard a car come up the drive. They both wore dark gray suits. One was tall and thin with thinning blonde hair. The other was shorter, broad through the shoulders with black hair combed flat against his head. Neither wore a coat. It was 34 degrees outside and raining. Their suits were dry. The taller man smiled and asked if I was Nathan Crowley. I said yes. He asked whether I had removed the floor. I asked who they were. He said they were checking an old insurance matter connected to the property. The shorter man looked past me toward the exposed boards. He did not ask about the roof, walls, wiring, or anything else I had been hired to repair. He asked, "Does the wood still smell metallic?" The question caught me off guard. I asked how he knew about the smell. He looked at the taller man. The taller man said, "Old fire damage can release mineral odors." I told him I had worked on plenty of burned buildings and never smelled anything like that. Neither responded. The shorter man stepped inside. I told him the building was an active work site and he needed permission from the owners. He stopped, but kept looking toward the black circles. "Were all 7 exposed?" he asked. I had not told them how many there were. I said nothing. The taller man asked whether any of the boards had been removed from the property. "No." "Cut?" "No." "Burned again?" I stared at him. "Why would I burn them again?" He gave a small shrug. The shorter man asked whether the smell became stronger after sunset. I said I did not know because I did not work there at night. He nodded, almost approvingly. Then he asked if I had heard the bell. I told him to leave. The taller man remained polite. He apologized for disturbing me and said they had all the information they needed. Before they went, the shorter man looked at the 7 marks and said, "They should have faded by now." The 2 men walked down the steps and around the north side of the church. I followed them outside. They were gone. There was no car on the road and no footprints in the wet gravel. I called Martin and told him what happened. He had not sent anyone. He checked with the insurance company. They had no claim open on the property and had not assigned any inspectors. I packed up early. Before leaving, I took a sample from one of the burned circles. It was a small chip about the size of my thumb. I sealed it in a plastic bag and placed it in my toolbox. When I got home, the bag was empty. It was still sealed. A fine black powder covered the bottom, but the piece of wood was gone. I did not go back to the church for 2 days. Martin called several times. He sounded worried, but did not want to stop the renovation. He offered to come up and stay while I worked. I agreed. We returned on Saturday morning. The weather had cleared. It was cold and bright, with frost on the grass and thin ice in the ditches. The front door was open. I knew I had locked it. Inside, the floorboards I had removed were back in place. They had not been nailed down, but they were fitted so carefully that I almost missed it. Each board had been returned to its original position. Martin helped me lift them again. The black circles were still underneath. The smell was stronger. Martin noticed it immediately. He said it reminded him of blood and electricity. We checked the building together. The bell tower was empty. The basement was empty. No windows were broken. Around noon, the generator shut off. It had a full tank and started normally when I pulled the cord. It ran for 5 seconds and stopped again. At the same time, we heard a vehicle outside. A black sedan sat near the cemetery gate. The 2 men were inside. They did not get out. Martin walked toward them, but the sedan reversed before he reached it. It backed down the narrow gravel road without turning around and disappeared into the trees. Martin came back pale and angry. He wanted to call the sheriff. There was no cell signal, so we drove into town. Deputy Carla Baines met us at a gas station. We told her about the men, the car, and the repeated entry into the church. She came back with us. The front door was locked. The boards were once again covering the scorch marks. Carla searched the church and took notes. She did not think anyone had been living there. She said the men could have been trespassers or history enthusiasts, though she admitted their questions were odd. She asked to see the burned floor. When we lifted the boards, there were only 6 circles. The 7th one, closest to the altar, was gone. The wood where it had been looked new, not repaired. New. The grain was lighter, and the surface had none of the scratches or stains found across the rest of the subfloor. Carla touched it. "It's warm," she said. The church had no heat. We left before dark. I told Martin I would finish the job only if someone else stayed on site with me. He agreed and hired a local handyman named Phil Doran. For the next week, Phil and I worked regular hours. Nothing major happened, but small things kept changing. Nails disappeared from sealed boxes. Measurements I wrote on studs were reversed the next morning. The bell rang once every day at 2:36 in the afternoon. The metallic smell returned whenever clouds covered the sun. On Thursday, Phil heard whispering behind the wall near the choir area. We opened the wall and found nothing but old insulation and mouse nests. On Friday, the black sedan passed the church 3 times. It never stopped. We finished laying the new floor the following Monday. Before covering the scorch marks, I photographed all 6. I also drew their positions on a sheet of plywood and wrote down the distances from each wall. The new floor was oak, sealed, and tight. Once it was installed, the smell disappeared. The owners came up that weekend to inspect the work. Everything looked normal. The following Tuesday, Martin called me. He said one of the new boards had turned black overnight. I drove back to the church, and a dark circle had appeared on the fresh oak floor in front of the altar. It was exactly where the missing 7th mark had been underneath. The wood was not burned. It was smooth and solid. The color went through the finish and into the grain. The circle smelled metallic. Martin wanted me to replace it. I cut out the affected boards and loaded them into my truck. As soon as I crossed the property line, my dashboard lights dimmed. The radio turned to static. A low hum filled the cab. I looked in the rearview mirror. The black sedan had pulled out behind me. It followed at the same distance for 6 miles. When I reached the main road, it turned away. I took the boards home and stacked them in my workshop. That night, something walked around the outside of the building for nearly an hour. I watched from my kitchen window. I never saw anyone, but the motion light came on one section at a time, moving slowly around the workshop. The next morning, the boards were gone. The workshop door was locked from the inside. On the concrete floor where I had stacked them were 7 dark circles. They were damp and cold. In the center of the last one was a small strip of clear tape. Under it, pressed flat against the floor, was a piece of old pine from the church. The wood was warm. It smelled like hot metal. The first compass pointed straight up when I reached the north anchor. I thought the needle had come loose. I was inspecting a radio tower outside Laramie, Wyoming on a cold morning in early March. The tower stood on a piece of federal land about 20 miles west of town, past a gravel service road that crossed open cattle range and ended near a low ridge. It was one of those tall red and white structures held by guy wires. There was a fenced equipment building at the base and not much else for miles. My name was Owen Mercer. I worked for a small engineering company that inspected communication towers for phone carriers, radio stations, and county agencies. Most of the job involved checking bolts, cable tension, corrosion, grounding, and damage from ice. That site had been having signal problems. Nothing major. Short dropouts, strange interference on one frequency, and a few reports that the backup link had lost its direction data. My supervisor, Dale Kessler, sent me out alone because the tower itself was not supposed to be active during the inspection. The weather was clear, but the wind had started picking up from the west. Patches of old snow remained in the ditches. The ground around the tower was frozen hard enough that my boots barely left marks. I parked beside the access gate at 8:10 and signed in on the site sheet. Everything looked normal at first. The locks were intact. The grounding straps were secure. No animal damage. No loose panels on the equipment shed. I carried 2 compasses because we used them to confirm cable orientation and check whether nearby metal was affecting certain readings. One was a basic handheld compass in a clear plastic case. The other was a more expensive sighting compass with a metal body. At the south anchor, both worked normally. At the east anchor, they worked normally. At the north anchor, the plastic compass needle tipped upward, not toward north, up. The red end rose until it pressed against the clear cover. The white end dropped against the bottom of the case. I held the compass level and tapped it. The needle returned to normal, swung north, then slowly tilted up again. I moved 10 feet back. It leveled out. I stepped forward. The red tip lifted. There was no large piece of metal near that anchor except the buried cable and a steel plate at ground level. Steel could pull a compass sideways. I had seen that plenty of times. I had never seen a needle try to stand vertically. I took out the sighting compass. Its needle did the same thing. The movement was slower because the housing damped it, but there was no doubt. The north end rose until it touched the glass. I walked in a circle around the anchor. The effect only happened inside a small area, maybe 6 feet across. At the edge, the needle began leaning. In the center, it pointed almost straight upward. I marked the spot with orange survey paint. Then I checked the tower drawings to see whether a buried grounding rod or cable junction ran through that area. Nothing was marked there. The North Guy anchor sat about 200 feet from the tower base. According to the plans, the only underground metal should have been the anchor shaft itself, angled down and toward the tower. That still would not explain a vertical pull. I called Dale. He said it was probably the anchor steel. I told him I had tested compasses beside hundreds of anchors. He laughed and said, Wyoming was full of iron deposits. I asked if there were any buried electrical lines. He checked the records and said no. Take a reading and move on, he told me. I took out my phone to record the compass. The camera showed the needle lying flat. I looked at the actual compass in my hand. It was pointing up. On the phone screen, the red tip pointed north like normal. I moved the camera closer. Same result. I stopped recording and played the clip back. The compass looked normal throughout. I tried again with the second compass. The recording showed no movement. That was when I started feeling uneasy. I told myself the camera angle was hiding it, so I took still pictures from the side. In every photo, the needle appeared level, even though I could see it leaning with my own eyes. I put the phone away. A low sound came from somewhere beneath the ground. It was not loud, more like a distant engine idling, except I felt it through my boots before I really heard it. The guy wire above me began vibrating slightly. I touched it with one glove. The cable was humming. The other 2 north side wires were still. I walked toward the tower, following the cable. The hum weakened after 20 or 30 feet. When I turned back, the orange paint mark looked farther away than it should have. I knew that sounded ridiculous, but I had paced the distance from the tower to the anchor on the way out. It was about 200 feet. From where I stood, the anchor looked at least twice that far away. I looked down at my boots and then back up. The distance appeared normal again. The hum stopped. I checked my watch. It showed 8:47. I had arrived at 8:10 and spent maybe 15 minutes opening the gate and checking the base. I could not account for the rest. My phone showed 8:47 too. I thought I had simply lost track of time while testing the compasses. I continued the inspection. At the west anchor, both needles worked normally. I climbed the tower after 9. The first 100 feet were routine. I checked bolts, braces, cable clips, and the ladder safety system. The wind was stronger higher up, but nothing unusual. At around 180 feet, I looked toward the north anchor. The orange paint mark was visible from above. Beside it stood a dark shape. I assumed it was a person. The figure was tall and narrow, dressed in dark clothing. It faced the tower and remained completely still. I called down. No response. My truck was still the only vehicle at the site. The access road ran across open ground, and I could see more than a mile of it. Nobody could have walked in without me noticing unless they had come from the ridge on the north side. I took out my radio and called the ground channel. Tower inspector to site visitor. Identify yourself. Only static answered. The figure tilted its head back. From that height, I could not see a face, but the movement was clear. Then the compass clipped to my vest flipped upward. The entire compass body rotated against its strap as if something above me had pulled it. I grabbed it. The needle pressed against the glass, pointing into the sky. I looked up. There were no aircraft, clouds, or birds, just a clear blue sky. The metal tower made a soft popping sound. One brace vibrated against my hand. Then a shadow passed over me. It lasted less than a second. I looked around, expecting a plane or bird. There was nothing overhead. When I looked down again, the figure near the north anchor was gone. I climbed back to the ground. I searched the area around the paint mark. There were no footprints in the frozen soil. The compass needles pointed up again. This time, both started spinning while they were tilted. Not fast. One slow rotation every few seconds. I placed them on the ground. They continued turning. The low vibration returned under my feet. A small patch of frost formed on the steel anchor plate. The air temperature was above freezing by then, and the rest of the metal was dry. I crouched to look closer. The frost spread in a narrow line across the plate, moved onto the frozen dirt, and stopped at the orange paint mark. Then my truck horn sounded. One long blast. I stood and looked toward the tower. The truck doors were closed. No one was near it. The horn sounded again. I walked back quickly. Halfway there, the radio inside my vest crackled. A man's voice said, "Remain outside the marked area." I stopped. The voice had not come through the normal channel. The display showed no active frequency. I asked who was speaking. No answer. Behind me, the compasses clicked against the frozen ground. I looked back. Both had fallen over. The needles were level again. I picked them up, wiped off the dirt, and returned to the truck. The horn had stopped. The driver's door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it because site rules required the vehicle to remain secure during a climb. Nothing had been taken. A thin layer of dust covered the dashboard, and someone had drawn a straight vertical line through it above the glove box. I finished the inspection without returning to the north anchor. At 11:20, I locked the gate and left. For the first few miles, the truck compass showed east, even though I was driving south. Then it corrected itself. I stopped at a diner outside Laramie and called Dale again. I explained the time issue, the radio voice, and the vertical compass readings. He was quiet for a while. Then he asked whether I had marked the location. I said yes. He told me to send the coordinates. I checked my handheld GPS. The saved point was missing. I drove back to the office and wrote the report from memory. I included a note that the compasses showed an unexplained vertical deviation near the north anchor. Dale removed that line from the final report. He said the client only wanted structural findings. I kept my own copy. The next morning, I woke with a dull headache and a metallic taste in my mouth. My watch had stopped at 8:47. It was a mechanical watch. It had been serviced 2 months earlier and had never stopped before. I shook it and it started again. Around noon, our receptionist, Melanie, said 2 men were waiting to speak with me. They stood in the front office. Both wore dark suits with white shirts. One was older, with gray hair and a narrow face. The other looked around 40, with dark hair cut very short. Neither wore a coat. It was 22 degrees outside, with snow blowing across the parking lot. Their shoes were dry. The older man introduced himself as Mr. Alden. He did not give the other man's name. He said they were following up on a navigation equipment issue. I asked if they worked for the tower owner. He said not directly. The younger man asked how many compasses I had carried. 2. Both analog? Yes. Any digital instruments? A GPS and the truck compass. He nodded. Neither man asked about the tower, the signal problems, the climb, or the condition of the equipment. They only asked about the compasses. The older man wanted to know whether the needles moved immediately or gradually. I said gradually. Did they align vertically or at an angle? Almost straight up. North end upward? Yes. He looked at the younger man. The younger man took out a small notebook. The older man asked whether the effect remained when I stepped away. I explained the 6-foot area. He asked whether the boundary felt sharp or uneven. I said it was sharp. How long were you inside it? I don't know. A few minutes. He watched me closely. Was time lost? I asked how he knew that. Neither answered. The younger man wrote something in the notebook. The older man asked if I had seen anyone near the marked location. I said yes. What did they do? Nothing. They stood there. Did they enter the marked area? They were already inside it. The older man looked annoyed for the first time. He asked whether the person left before or after the compass on my vest moved. I had not told them about the compass on my vest. I asked who had sent them. The younger man kept writing. The older one said their work involved magnetic hazards. I told him magnetic fields strong enough to pull a compass needle vertically could be dangerous around tower electronics. He gave a slight smile. It was not magnetic. I waited for him to explain. He did not. The younger man turned the notebook so the older man could see what he had written. I saw the words before he closed it. Vertical deviation confirmed. I asked what that meant. The older man said they were done. I told them I had photographs and video, though that was not completely true. I had the useless recordings showing normal needles. Neither asked to see them. The younger man only asked, were the compasses taken away from the site? I said yes. Where are they now? I told him they were in my truck. The older man's expression changed. Both of them? Yes. He asked me to wait inside. Then the two men walked out through the front door. I followed them. They crossed the parking lot toward my truck. I shouted for them to stop. Neither turned around. By the time I reached the vehicle, they were gone. There was no car in the lot except mine, Dale's pickup, and Melanie's SUV. The doors to my truck were locked. Inside, the two compasses sat on the passenger seat where I had left them. Both needles pointed straight upward. I unlocked the door. The needles dropped flat the moment I touched the handle. A folded piece of white paper lay beneath them. It was a copy of the tower site plan. The north anchor had been circled. Someone had drawn a second circle 6 feet beside it in a place where the plans showed empty ground. Underneath, typed in small letters, was a date from 1968. I took the paper to Dale. He stared at it for a long time. Then he went to a locked filing cabinet in his office and pulled out an old maintenance folder. The tower had been rebuilt in 1989, but the original structure dated back to the late 60s. The folder contained a report from the first construction crew. One page described workers having trouble with magnetic surveying tools near the north anchor. The foreman had written that every compass became unreliable in one small location. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. Needles pulled vertical. Area moved 6 feet east after excavation. The date matched the one on the paper from my truck. Dale closed the folder. He said we were not going back to the site until the client answered some questions. The client never answered. 2 days later, the inspection contract was canceled. The official reason was a change in ownership. About a week after that, I saw the dark-haired man again. He was standing outside my apartment building just after sunset. Snow was falling lightly. He wore the same suit and no coat. He stood beside the street and looked up at my second-floor window. I stepped outside and asked what he wanted. He did not move. I walked closer. He said, "You should not carry both." I asked what he meant. He looked at the canvas work bag hanging from my shoulder. I had one of the compasses inside. The other was locked in my desk at work. He said, "They do not point toward the location." Then what do they point toward? He looked up. For a second, the streetlights dimmed. A faint white light moved behind the clouds, too slow to be a plane and too wide to be a spotlight. The man watched it until it disappeared. Then he looked back at me. They point away from it. A city bus turned onto the street between us. When it passed, he was gone. I went upstairs and placed the compass on my kitchen table. The needle pointed north. At 8:47 that evening, it began to tilt. The red end rose halfway, stopped, and held there. I looked toward the ceiling. A low vibration passed through the apartment, gentle enough that the glass in the windows barely moved. The compass needle rose another fraction. Then it dropped flat. Outside, something crossed above the building without making a sound. I waited until the vibration stopped, put the compass in a metal toolbox, and drove it back to the office. I left both compasses in Dale's locked cabinet. The next morning, the cabinet was still locked. The compasses were gone. In their place was the younger man's notebook. Every page was blank except the last one. At the top, he had written my name. Below it was a single line. Subject returned home without further deviation. I saw the black shape when I checked the last set of photos in my car. I had been out at Horicon Marsh in Wisconsin since before sunrise, trying to photograph sandhill cranes as they moved south. It was late October, cold and damp, with a solid layer of gray cloud hanging low over the marsh. The light was bad for pictures, but there were hundreds of birds in the area, so I stayed. My name was Claire Donnelly. I worked from home doing medical billing, and bird photography was what I did when I needed to get away from screens and phone calls. I was not a professional, but I had decent equipment and knew the common migration routes. That morning, I parked at a small observation area on the west side of the marsh. There was one other vehicle when I arrived, an old green pickup, but whoever owned it was already out on the trail. The first strange thing happened around 7. A large group of cranes had been feeding in a cut cornfield beyond the water. I had counted roughly 80 through the viewfinder. They were noisy, moving around, lifting and lowering their heads. Then they all stopped at once. Every bird faced north. I had seen flocks react to hawks, dogs, and low aircraft, but usually some birds noticed before the others. This was immediate. 1 second they were feeding. The next, every neck was straight and every head pointed the same way. I lowered the camera and listened. The marsh had gone quiet. The geese stopped calling. The red-winged blackbirds in the reeds stopped too. Even the wind seemed to die for a few seconds. I looked north but saw only low clouds. Then the cranes began walking. They did not take off. They moved together across the field in a tight group, heading toward a drainage ditch. It looked organized in a way I had never seen. None of them spread their wings or called. I took several photos. After maybe a minute, the normal noise returned. Geese called from the water and the reeds began moving again. The cranes broke apart and started feeding as if nothing had happened. I checked my phone. It showed 7:08. The camera clock showed 7:13. I assumed one of them needed resetting. A little later, I moved down the trail toward a raised viewing platform. The clouds were beginning to break in places with brighter patches showing through. The temperature stayed just above freezing and a light mist hung over the open water. I saw the green pickup owner on the far side of the platform. He was an older man with a camouflage jacket and a long camera lens. We nodded to each other but did not talk. A flock of Canada geese came in from the southeast. There had to be 200 of them. They formed a loose V, then split into several groups as they crossed over the marsh. I started taking pictures. Through the viewfinder, I noticed a dark spot above the clouds. That made no sense because the clouds should have blocked anything higher than them. At first, I thought there was dirt on the lens or a dead pixel in the camera screen. I lowered the camera. The spot was not visible with my eyes. I raised it again. The dark shape remained. It was near the upper left corner of the frame, far above the geese. It looked like a black oval, though one side seemed flatter than the other. I changed lenses. The shape was still there. I asked the man on the platform if he saw anything unusual above the geese. He looked up. "Just birds," he said. I handed him my camera. He looked through the viewfinder for several seconds. "What am I looking for?" I pointed to the upper left. He moved the camera around and gave it back. "I don't see anything." When I looked again, the shape was there. It appeared larger. Not much larger, but enough that I could make out a hard lower edge and a softer top that seemed to fade into the cloud layer. It did not move with the clouds. It did not drift or change angle. The geese passed beneath it. I took a burst of photographs. The camera froze after the 9th shot. The screen went black, and none of the buttons responded. I removed the battery, waited, and put it back in. The camera restarted normally. The older man asked if something was wrong. I said the camera had locked up. He told me cold weather did that sometimes. Then he packed his equipment and left. I stayed on the platform. Another group of birds approached from the east. These were cranes, maybe 40 or 50, flying much higher than the first flock. As they came closer to the dark shape, their formation changed. The leading birds veered sharply south. The rest followed, but not smoothly. The flock folded inward, almost colliding with itself. Several birds dropped lower, and one broke away completely. I had never seen cranes turn like that without an obvious cause. They passed below the cloud line and disappeared into the mist. The black shape remained in the same place. I took more photos. This time, the camera worked, but the shutter sounded wrong. It was slower and deeper, as if the mechanism was dragging. After 5 pictures, the viewfinder dimmed. The shape seemed to rotate. I could not tell whether the object itself moved or whether the clouds shifted around it. The flat edge turned slightly toward me, and for a moment, the shape looked less like an oval and more like a narrow vertical line. Then it vanished. There was no movement away. It was simply there in one frame and gone in the next. The marsh noise stopped again. I waited for it to return. It did not. A few geese circled above the water without calling. They landed near the reeds and stood very still. I looked toward the parking area. My car was visible through the bare trees. The green pickup was gone. A person stood beside my car. They were too far away for me to see clearly, but they looked tall and wore dark clothing. They were not moving. I raised the camera and zoomed in. The viewfinder showed an empty parking lot. I lowered it. The person was still there. I tried again. Through the camera, nobody stood beside the car. I started walking back. The person remained in place until I reached the lower part of the trail. Then a patch of mist moved across the parking area. When it cleared, the person was gone. I stopped about 50 yards from my car. There were no other vehicles, no footsteps on the gravel. The ground beside my driver's door was wet and soft, but it showed no prints. A faint tapping came from the roof. 3 quick taps. I thought a branch had fallen, but there were no branches above the car. I unlocked the door and looked inside. Nothing seemed disturbed. My camera bag was where I left it. My thermos sat in the cup holder. The passenger seat was empty. I got in and locked the doors. The tapping came again, this time from the rear window. I turned around. There was nothing outside. I started the engine and backed out. As I drove toward the main road, a group of cranes rose from the field beside me. They flew low across the road, forcing me to stop. There were fewer than there had been earlier. I could not have said exactly how many. I had not been counting once they spread out. Still, the field looked strangely empty. The flock crossed in front of the car. One bird near the back flew with its legs hanging down. It seemed tired or injured. It lost height, recovered, then followed the others toward the marsh. Behind the flock, above the clouds, the black shape appeared again. I saw it through the windshield this time. It was much farther north, nearly hidden by the gray sky. It looked flat and dark, like a hole cut into the clouds. I grabbed the camera from the passenger seat. Before I could take a picture, the radio filled with static. A low tone came through the speakers. The dashboard clock changed from 9:26 to 9:26 again, blinking as if the car had lost power, though the engine kept running. The flock disappeared over the reeds. The black shape faded until I could not separate it from the clouds. I drove home. I lived outside Beaver Dam in a 1-story house with a small backyard and a row of pine trees behind it. The trip from the marsh usually took about 35 minutes. When I pulled into my driveway, the dashboard clock showed 10:41. I had left the marsh at 9:26. There had been no traffic and I had not stopped. My phone showed the same time. I sat in the car and tried to work out where the extra 40 minutes had gone. I remembered the whole drive. County Road Z, the turn near the feed store, the railroad crossing, the water tower. Nothing was missing. Inside the house, my dog, Pepper, would not come near me. She stayed in the hallway with her ears back, watching the camera bag. When I set it on the kitchen table, she went into the bedroom and hid under the bed. I removed the memory card and put it into my computer. The early photos looked normal. Cranes in the cornfield, geese over the water, mist above the reeds. Then I reached the burst I had taken when I first saw the shape. In the first image, the black object appeared above the clouds. It was clearer than it had looked through the viewfinder. The lower edge was straight. The upper part curved slightly, and there was a thin, lighter area around it, like the clouds had been pushed away. In the next 4 images, it remained motionless while the geese moved across the frame. In the 5th, several birds were missing. I went back and compared the shots. There had been 37 geese in one section of the flock. In the next frame, there were 32. The pictures had been taken less than a second apart. No birds were leaving the edge of the image. There were simply 5 empty spaces in the formation. In the 6th frame, 2 of the geese reappeared. The other 3 did not. I checked the rest of the photos. The crane flock showed the same problem. I counted 48 birds as they approached the black shape. After they turned, there were 41. I enlarged the image. Near the dark object were several small marks that might have been birds. They were blurry and much higher than the flock. One looked stretched into a thin vertical line. I tried opening the final photos from the parking lot. The files were corrupted. The thumbnails showed my car from a distance. That was impossible because I had been holding the camera on the trail. In one thumbnail, the tall person stood beside the driver's door. In another, the person was closer to the rear of the car. The last thumbnail showed only the car roof and a large black area filling the upper half of the image. When I clicked any of them, the computer gave an error. I copied the usable photos to an external drive. Then I called the older photographer from the platform. I did not know his name, but I had seen him several times before. The Marsh Visitor Center put me in touch with him after I described his truck. His name was Gerald Pike. Gerald answered at home. I asked if his camera had captured anything unusual that morning. He was quiet. Then he asked what I meant. I told him about the black shape. He said he had not seen it. I asked if he still had the photos he took while we were on the platform. He said yes. A few minutes later, he emailed me 3 images. They showed geese crossing the clouds. The black object was visible in every one. Gerald called again after he looked at the images on his computer. He sounded shaken. He said the shape had not been there when he reviewed the photos at the marsh. I asked him to count the birds. He did. There were 61 geese in the first picture, 58 in the second, and 61 again in the third. The missing birds reappeared in different positions. Gerald said he was deleting the files. I told him not to. He hung up. That evening around 6, someone knocked at my front door. It was fully dark and colder than it had been that morning. A light rain had started and the temperature was dropping toward freezing. 2 men stood on the porch. One looked about 50, with gray hair and a narrow face. The other was younger, maybe 35, with short blonde hair and pale eyebrows. Both wore dark suits. Neither wore a coat. The older man smiled and asked if I was Claire Donnelly. I said yes. He told me they were conducting a wildlife survey connected to migration changes in the area. I asked for identification. He showed me a card inside a black wallet. I saw a seal and some text, but he closed it before I could read the agency name. The younger man asked if I had been photographing birds at Horicon that morning. I said I had. What time did the main flock pass the north observation platform? I told him I was not sure. He asked whether I had seen anything above the cloud layer. I did not answer. The older man said, "Did you notice any missing birds afterward?" The question was so specific that I felt my stomach tighten. I asked what he meant by missing. Fewer returning than entered the area. I wasn't counting them. The younger man watched me. Not at the time, he said. I had not told them I counted the birds in the photos. I asked who sent them. The older man ignored the question. He asked if any birds had fallen from the flock. I said no. Did any return from above the cloud cover? I don't know. Did you hear them? Hear what? The ones that returned. Neither man seemed interested in the photographs themselves. They did not ask to see my camera or files. They only asked about the number of birds. The younger man took out a small notebook. How many were absent in the first sequence? He asked. I said I had not counted. He waited. I told him 3 geese remained missing between frames. He wrote it down. And the cranes? 7. The older man's expression changed slightly. 7 remained absent? Yes. He looked at the younger man. The younger man wrote another line. I asked what happened to them. The older man said, "They may not have been absent." That doesn't make sense. It depends on where the count was made. I told them to leave. The older man remained polite. He thanked me and stepped back from the door. The younger man looked past me toward the kitchen table where my camera sat. He asked if the original memory card was still inside the house. I said yes. He nodded. "Keep it indoors tonight." Why? Neither answered. They walked down the driveway. There was no car parked on the street. I watched them pass the mailbox and continue toward the dark road. Freezing rain hit their shirts, but neither hurried. A truck came around the corner and blocked my view for a moment. When it passed, the men were gone. I called Gerald. His wife answered and said he was asleep. I asked if anyone had visited him. She said 2 wildlife officers had come by that afternoon. They had asked how many birds he photographed and whether any seemed to return from the wrong direction. Gerald had given them his memory card. I went back to the computer. The external drive containing my copied photos was no longer connected. I found it on the floor beneath the desk. The cable was still plugged into the computer, but the drive had been removed from it. The memory card remained in the reader. I opened the last crane photograph again. There had been 41 birds after the flock turned. Now there were 48. All 7 had returned, but they were not in the flock. They appeared much higher near the black shape. Each bird was suspended in a different position, wings spread and bodies tilted at odd angles. None showed motion blur. I enlarged the image. The closest crane faced the camera. Its neck was straight and its beak was open. Behind it, partly hidden inside the dark shape, were dozens of smaller pale forms. The photo closed by itself. My screen went black. From the backyard came the sound of cranes calling. It was loud enough to fill the house. Pepper began barking from under the bed. I turned off the kitchen light and looked through the back window. 7 cranes stood in the yard between the pine trees. They were spaced evenly apart. None moved. The freezing rain struck their backs and ran off their feathers. All 7 faced the house. Above them, hidden behind the low clouds, something blocked the faint orange glow from town. The cranes remained there for almost a minute. Then they lifted together. Their wings made no sound. They rose into the clouds and disappeared. The dark area above the trees moved east. My computer screen came back on. The photograph was open again. The 7 cranes were gone from the sky. At the bottom of the frame, beside my parked car, stood 2 men without coats. I found the black sedan sitting halfway in the ditch on Old Quarry Road a little after 1 in the morning. The call had come through county dispatch as an abandoned vehicle, no driver located. That usually meant somebody had slid off the road, walked home, and planned to deal with it later. It had been raining since evening, and the temperature had dropped enough that the shoulders were starting to freeze. My name was Travis Bell. I drove nights for Miller's Towing outside Morgantown, West Virginia. We handled police impounds, wrecks, dead batteries, whatever came in after the other guys went home. Old Quarry Road ran through a narrow valley west of town. There were a few houses near the main highway, but after that, it was mostly woods, old mine land, and one closed limestone operation. Cell service dropped in and out. The road twisted along a creek and ended at a locked gate about 6 miles in. The sedan was parked near mile marker 4. It had not crashed. That was the first thing that seemed wrong. The front wheels rested in the shallow ditch, but there were no skid marks, no mud thrown behind the tires, and no damage to the bumper. It looked like someone had slowly driven off the pavement and stopped. A deputy named Connor Price waited beside his cruiser with the lights flashing. He stood under a black rain jacket, writing on a clipboard. "You see anybody?" I asked. Connor shook his head. "No driver, no witnesses. Door was unlocked." "What kind of car?" He looked back at it. "That's part of the problem." The sedan was large and black with a long hood and square rear end. From a distance, it looked like an older Lincoln, maybe late 80s or early 90s. Up close, the proportions were off. The roof was a little too low and the wheelbase seemed too long. There were no badges on the trunk or grille. The paint looked almost new, but the chrome around the windows was dull and spotted. The tires had deep tread and no brand names on the sidewalls. I shined my flashlight at the rear plate. There was no plate. The mounting holes were there, but they were spaced wider than normal. Connor said a county employee had spotted the car around midnight and called it in. The employee claimed the sedan had been blocking the road at first. By the time Connor arrived, it was in the ditch. "Maybe somebody moved it?" I said. Connor looked down the dark road. "With what?" I checked the doors. All 4 were unlocked. The interior was black vinyl, no trash, no floor mats, no papers in the glove box. The ashtray had never been used. There was no radio in the dashboard, only a smooth black panel. The steering wheel had no logo. I opened the driver's door and noticed the seat was pushed almost all the way back. Whoever drove it would have needed long legs. The key was still in the ignition. It was a plain metal key with no plastic head. There were no numbers or markings stamped into it. Connor told me not to start the car until he finished his initial check. I opened the hood. The engine compartment was clean, but I could not identify the engine. It looked like an old V8 at first. Then I noticed there were no visible belts. No alternator where I expected one, no readable labels, and no battery in the usual place. A bundle of thick black cables ran along the firewall and disappeared beneath a metal cover. Connor leaned over beside me. "What is that?" "No idea." "You ever seen one like it?" "No." The metal under the hood felt warm. Not hot like the engine had been running, just warmer than the surrounding air. The rain hissed when it struck the center of the hood, but there was no steam. I checked the door frame for the manufacturer's sticker. Nothing. Then I checked the dashboard near the windshield for the VIN plate. Nothing there either. Connor searched the door jambs, trunk, and engine bay. We found no VIN anywhere. That was unusual enough that he called his supervisor. While he talked, I walked around the car and checked the ground. There were tire impressions in the ditch, but only directly under the wheels. No tracks led from the pavement to where the sedan rested. The wet grass between the road and the tires stood upright. I pointed that out when Connor finished his call. He stared at the ditch, then crouched with his flashlight. "That's not possible." "It had to get down there somehow." He touched the grass. Water ran off the blades. None were bent. We looked at each other without saying anything. A low sound came from inside the car. It was faint and steady, like an electric motor running behind a wall. The sedan's headlights turned on. Neither of us was near the switch. The beams were pale and wide. They lit the trees across the road, but the light did not look right. It had no clear center. Everything in front of the car became flat and gray. Connor stepped back and put one hand near his holster. The sound stopped. The headlights remained on. I reached through the driver's door and turned the switch on the dashboard. It clicked, but the lights did not change. I pulled the key from the ignition. The lights stayed on. Connor said, "Get it loaded." I lowered the wheel lift and backed toward the sedan. The tow truck's reverse alarm began cutting in and out. One beep sounded normal. The next was stretched and low. Then the whole electrical panel flickered. I stopped and checked the gauges. Everything returned to normal. The sedan's headlights went dark. I hooked the front wheels and raised them. The car was heavier than it looked. My truck could handle it, but the hydraulics strained more than they should have. As the sedan lifted, water ran from underneath. It was clear at first, then darkened into something that looked almost black on the wet pavement. It had a metallic smell, sharp and bitter. Connor shined his light beneath the car. There was no exhaust pipe. There was no drive shaft either. The entire underside was covered by smooth black panels. "You sure this is a car?" he asked. I thought he was joking, but he looked serious. I secured the steering wheel, attached the safety chains, and checked the rear wheels. One tire slowly turned while I stood beside it. The car was lifted at the front, transmission in park, and the ground beneath the rear tire was flat. There was no reason for it to move. I put my boot against it. The tire stopped. When I stepped away, it began turning again. Connor told me to leave it. We drove back toward town with his cruiser following behind. The sedan swayed less than any car I had ever towed. Even on sharp curves, it remained straight. It felt like I had attached something fixed to the road behind me rather than a vehicle. At the old quarry gate, my radio filled with static. A voice came through for half a second. It sounded like a man saying my last name. I called dispatch. No answer. The static became a low humming tone. Then the truck's dashboard clock changed from 1:38 to 1:12. I tapped the screen. It stayed at 1 to 12 for several seconds, then jumped forward to 1:49. I checked my phone. It showed 1:49. I had no memory of the previous 11 minutes. I was still driving on Old Quarry Road, but I had passed the turn near the abandoned mine office without noticing. Connor's cruiser remained behind me. I called him on the radio. He answered immediately. "You okay?" "Did we stop?" "No." "What time do you have?" He paused. 1:49. "Were we just back at the quarry gate?" Another pause. "I thought so." We had traveled nearly 3 miles, but neither of us remembered it. The sedan's rear lights came on. There were no bulbs visible in the housings, but 2 dull red rectangles glowed through the dark lenses. Connor said, "I'm seeing that." The lights blinked once, then both radios went dead. The tow yard sat behind Miller's repair shop in an industrial area near the river. We arrived just after 2. The rain had turned to sleet. I parked the sedan inside the fenced impound lot and lowered it onto the pavement. Connor stayed while I completed the intake sheet. Under make and model, I wrote unknown black 4-door. Under VIN, I wrote none located. Connor took several photographs. In each one, the sedan looked blurred around the roofline, even though the fence and buildings behind it were sharp. He tried with his phone and then with his department camera. Same result. I took a picture with mine. The car appeared normal, but there was a tall, dark shape reflected in the driver's window. No one stood beside me. I deleted the picture. Connor sealed the doors with evidence tape and left around 2:30. I stayed to finish paperwork. The car sat beneath a security light at the far end of the lot. From the office window, I could see its roof and windshield over 2 damaged pickup trucks. Around 3, the motion alarm beeped. One of the yard cameras had detected movement. The monitor showed the sedan. Its driver's door was open. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. The rain had stopped. The yard was quiet except for water dripping from the shop roof. The driver's door was closed when I reached the car. The evidence tape remained unbroken. I checked the camera again. The recording clearly showed the door opening at 3:01. It moved slowly until it was fully open. Then the video skipped. At 3:03, the door was closed. Nothing entered or left the frame. I locked the office and went home shortly after that. At 7 the next morning, my boss, Ray Miller, called and asked why I had brought in a car without an intake number. I told him the sheriff's department had ordered the tow. He said there was no sedan in the yard. I drove back immediately. The car was still there. Ray stood 10 feet from it holding a coffee. He looked confused when I pointed. I swear that wasn't there when I opened the gate. The sedan's windows were fogged from the inside. There had been nobody in it, and the doors were still sealed. We called Connor. He arrived with another deputy and searched the car again. This time, the trunk would not open with the key or the interior release. We tried a lockout tool and got nowhere. Connor said the vehicle would be processed later that afternoon. Until then, no one was to touch it. At 10:20, 2 men walked into the front office. I noticed them because neither wore a coat. The temperature was 26 degrees, and freezing rain had started again. Both men wore gray suits, white shirts, and dark ties. One was tall and pale, with straight brown hair. The other was shorter and broad-faced, with thinning gray hair. Their clothes were dry. The tall man placed a folder on the counter. "We're here for the recovered vehicle," he said. Ray asked for identification. The broad-faced man showed a card inside a black wallet. He held it up for less than a second. The folder contained a release form, a towing authorization, and a copy of a registration. The paperwork listed a blue 2017 Chevrolet Malibu. The VIN had 17 digits. The plate number was from Ohio. Ray looked through the office window at the black sedan. "That isn't a blue Malibu." The tall man glanced outside. "No." "Then this paperwork is for the wrong car." The broad-faced man said, "The paperwork is correct." Ray handed the folder back. "We can't release a vehicle that doesn't match." The tall man did not argue. He looked at me. "Did you tow it from Old Quarry Road?" I said yes. "Was it in contact with the road surface when you arrived?" The question sounded odd. The front wheels were in the ditch. "Were there tracks?" I did not answer. He watched my face. The broad-faced man asked whether the vehicle's lights had activated before recovery. Ray looked at me. I said they had. "White or yellow?" "White." "Continuous?" "For a few minutes." The tall man asked whether either compass in my truck had changed direction. I told him I did not carry a compass. He nodded as if that was good news. Neither man asked about the condition of the sedan, the missing VIN, or the lack of registration. They did not inspect the damage because there was none. They only asked about what had happened near it. The broad-faced man opened a small notebook. "Did the vehicle remain closed during transport?" "Yes." "Did you observe anyone inside?" "No." "Did it produce sound after the engine was disabled?" "I never started the engine." He stopped writing. The 2 men looked at each other. The tall one asked, "The key remained unused?" "Yes." He appeared relieved. Ray told them again that he could not release the sedan with mismatched paperwork. The broad-faced man said, "We aren't asking you to release the sedan." "Then why are you here?" "To confirm the recovery conditions." Ray pushed the folder back across the counter. The tall man left it there. Before they turned to leave, he asked me whether I had opened the trunk. I said no. Did you attempt to? Yes. Did it respond? I thought about the wording. No. He gave a small nod. The broad-faced man wrote one final line in the notebook. I could see part of it from where I stood. Recovered, unopened. They walked out. There was no vehicle waiting in the parking lot. Ray and I followed them to the door. The men crossed the road toward an empty warehouse. A delivery van passed between us. When it cleared, they were gone. The folder remained on the counter. The paperwork still described the blue Malibu, but the VIN line was blank. At noon, Connor returned with an impound investigator. They planned to photograph the car, lift fingerprints, and search for hidden identification numbers. The sedan was locked. The key no longer fit the ignition or any of the doors. Connor tried the trunk again. It opened. There was nothing inside except a square piece of black carpet and a folded road map. The map showed Old Quarry Road. A thin line had been drawn from the place where I found the sedan to Miller's Towing. Another line continued from the tow yard to my house. I had not given anyone my home address. The investigator took the map and sealed it in an evidence bag. Then he checked the spare tire well. There was no spare tire. At the bottom of the compartment, stamped directly into the metal, was a series of numbers. It looked like a VIN until Connor read it aloud. The first 6 digits were the date. The next 4 were 01112, the time my dashboard clock had changed to. The final digits matched the last numbers of my tow truck's license plate. Connor stopped reading. The broad-faced man's notebook was lying on the ground beneath the rear bumper. It had not been there earlier. Every page was blank except one. The writing read, "Vehicle remained with recovery operator for 47 minutes. I told Connor the tow had taken longer than that. He checked his report. According to his dispatch log, we left Old Quarry Road at 1:38 and reached the tow yard at 2:25. 47 minutes exactly. We had arrived around 2, or at least that was what both of us remembered. The security system showed the gate opening at 2:25. The office camera showed me entering at 2:26. There was no recording of the missing time. The county decided to move the sedan to a secured evidence garage. A flatbed arrived at 4. The driver winched the car onto the deck because nobody could get it into neutral. The rear wheels remained locked, but they left no tire marks on the wet pavement. As the truck pulled away, the sedan's headlights came on. The driver stopped and got out. The lights shut off before he reached the cab. Connor followed the flatbed to the county facility. I went home after my shift. A black sedan sat across from my house when I arrived. For a few seconds, I thought the county truck had somehow brought it there. Then I noticed this car had a rear plate. It was an Ohio plate. The same number listed on the paperwork for the blue Malibu. No one sat in the driver's seat. I stayed in my tow truck and called Connor. He answered from the evidence garage. The original sedan was parked in front of him. I looked across the street. The other car's rear door opened. It remained open for several seconds. Nothing got out. Then the interior light came on. The back seat was empty, but the upholstery was wet. Water dripped onto the pavement even though it had stopped raining. A low humming sound came through my truck's radio. The dashboard clock changed to 1:12. The sedan's rear door closed. It pulled away from the curb without headlights and drove toward the end of the street. I followed it for 2 blocks. At the next intersection, a blue Chevrolet Malibu crossed in front of me. When it passed, the black sedan was gone. I drove home, locked the doors, and called Ray to tell him I would not be coming in the next morning. Before I went inside, I checked the back of the tow truck. A plain metal key lay in the wheel lift. It had no plastic head and no markings. Tied around it was a paper tag. The tag listed my truck's year, make, model, and correct VIN. Under vehicle color, someone had written black. The first man corrected me before I had finished packing up the projector. He said, "There were no reports in 1986. I thought he meant I had made a mistake in one of the dates." The talk had been held in the meeting room above the library in Marlow, Oregon, a small town on the eastern side of the Cascades. I had spent the evening going through 70 years of strange aerial sightings reported in the Wren Valley, which ran north of town between 2 low volcanic ridges. My name was Simon Greaves. I taught history at the community college in Bend and helped manage the Marlow Historical Society on weekends. Most of my research involved old logging camps, irrigation projects, and local families. The lights over Wren Valley were more of a side interest. They kept showing up in records. There were newspaper articles from 1952, sheriff's notes from 1964, handwritten letters from farmers in the 70s, and emergency radio logs from the 90s. The descriptions changed, but the location remained almost exactly the same. People reported white lights moving low over the fields, dark shapes above the ridge, radios cutting out, and livestock gathering near fences. I never claimed the reports proved anything. My talk was called 70 Years of Unexplained Lights in Wren Valley. About 30 people attended. Most were retired locals. A few younger people came because someone had shared the event online. The weather had turned bad that afternoon. Cold rain fell steadily, and fog filled the lower parts of the valley. By the time I finished, it was nearly 9, and the library windows had gone black. The two men had sat in the back row. I noticed them because neither took off his coat during the talk. One looked around 50, with gray hair cut short and a narrow face. The other was younger, maybe 35, with dark hair and very pale skin. They had not asked questions during the public discussion. After everyone else left, they approached the table where I had spread out copies of maps, newspaper clippings, and old photographs. The older man told me the presentation was thorough. The younger one said, except for 1986. I looked at the timeline projected on the wall. The 1986 entry referred to 6 reports made over 3 nights in November. A rancher, 2 county road workers, a school bus driver, and several residents had described a bright object moving through the valley during heavy snow. I have the original reports, I said. No, the older man replied. You have references to reports. He said it politely, almost like a teacher correcting a student. I opened the folder labeled 1986. Inside were photocopies from the Marlow Gazette and typed notes made by the sheriff's department. I held up the first article. This ran on November 14th. The younger man did not look at it. That date did not occur here, he said. I laughed because I thought he was making some kind of joke. Neither man smiled. I asked what they meant. The older one pointed at the folder. The sequence is incorrect. What sequence? The year. I said 1986 had obviously happened. Not in the valley, the younger man said. They refused to explain further. I asked if they represented an agency, a research group, or one of the families mentioned in the reports. The older man said they were interested in the accuracy of public records. I asked for their names. He said, Mr. Kale. The younger man gave no name. Then they left. I watched from the upstairs window as they crossed the library parking lot. The rain was still coming down hard, but neither opened an umbrella. They walked toward the alley beside the post office. There was no car waiting there. I stayed another 20 minutes to finish packing. When I removed the 1986 folder from the table, I noticed a wet mark beneath it. It was a narrow oval about the size of a shoe print. The folder itself was dry. I wiped the table and carried everything downstairs. The librarian, Paula Wicks, was waiting to lock up. I told her about the men and asked if she knew them. She said she had never seen them before. Then she asked why I had included the November 1986 reports. I told her they were among the best documented incidents in the valley. Paula looked confused. She had lived in Marlow her whole life. In November 1986, she had been 17 and working part-time at the same library. She said the library had been closed that entire month because a water pipe burst. That doesn't affect the sightings, I said. No, she replied. I mean, I don't remember that month. She laughed after saying it, but the sound came out forced. On the drive home, I took Highway 22 east toward my house outside Sisters. The rain changed to wet snow near the pass, and visibility dropped. Wren Valley was not on my route, but I could see the southern entrance from one section of the highway. It appeared as a broad, dark gap between 2 ridges with scattered farm lights along the bottom. As I passed the turnoff, every radio station disappeared. The speakers produced a low, steady tone. I switched the radio off. The tone continued. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. A pale light appeared over the valley. At first, I thought it was lightning behind the clouds, but the glow stayed in one place. It lit the fog from above and moved slowly north. I pulled onto the shoulder. The light narrowed into a white line. Something dark passed beneath it. I could not make out a clear shape. It looked larger than an aircraft and moved too slowly to stay in the air. There were no blinking lights and no sound. The glow faded behind the western ridge. My dashboard clock showed 9:34. I checked my phone. It showed 9:51. 17 minutes had passed while I stood beside the road. I remembered less than 2. A truck came up behind me, and I drove on. At home, I carried the boxes into my study. My wife, Rachel, was already asleep. I made coffee and started checking the 1986 folder. The first article was exactly where it should have been. The headline read, "Lights Reported Over Wren Valley." The article described several people seeing a bright oval object on November 12, 1986. I checked the next clipping. It had changed. I knew how that sounded, but I had used the clipping in my presentation only a few hours earlier. It had described a second night of reports. Now it was a story about the high school basketball team. The date remained November 13, 1986. I checked the other pages. 2 sheriff's logs were blank except for the date at the top. A photocopied letter from a rancher named Harold Voss had become a page of pale gray marks. The words were still faintly visible underneath, but only when I held it at an angle. I scanned the letter into my computer and increased the contrast. Most of the text returned. Harold described seeing a white light above his cattle field around 3 in the morning. The cows had gathered in a tight circle and refused to move. His kitchen clock stopped. His wife heard someone walking around the house. Near the bottom was a line I had never noticed. 2 men visited the following day and asked whether the light had arrived before the snow or after it. I read the sentence several times. Then I heard 3 taps on the study window. The window faced the side yard. There was no porch outside and no tree close enough to touch the glass. I stood up. 3 more taps came from the same spot. I turned off the desk lamp and looked outside. Snow had started collecting on the grass. A man stood near the back fence. He wore a dark coat and faced the house. I could not see his features, but he was too tall to be either of my neighbors. I stepped back and reached for my phone. When I looked again, the yard was empty. The clock on my desk had stopped at 11:12. In the morning, I called the county archives. The archivist, a woman named Nadine Cho, agreed to let me review their original records from 1986. I drove to Marlow after lunch. The storm had passed, but fog remained in the valley. The roads were wet and the temperature had dropped below freezing. Nadine brought out 3 storage boxes. The first contained property records. The second held county meeting minutes. The third should have held sheriff's incident reports. The third box was empty. A note taped inside said the documents had been transferred to another office in 1991. It did not say which office. Nadine checked the database. There was no record of a transfer. I asked whether other years were missing. Only 1986. The county meeting minutes showed another problem. The meeting held on October 28 ended normally. The next meeting was dated December 2nd. There were no minutes for November. I asked Nadine if meetings had been canceled because of weather. She checked the local calendars and shook her head. Every Tuesday in November had been crossed out with black pencil. The marks looked recent. While we were examining them, the building's lights dimmed. The security door at the end of the archive room clicked open. No one came through. A low humming sound moved along the ceiling. It began above the door and traveled toward us. The fluorescent lights flickered one by one as it passed. Nadine whispered, "Do you hear that?" Before I answered, the sound stopped directly above the table. The box containing the 1986 files shifted. It moved less than an inch, but both of us saw it. Then the lights returned to normal. We left the archive room. Nadine refused to go back inside until another employee joined us. When we returned, the empty box contained a folder. The label read Wren Valley, November 1986. Neither of us had placed it there. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a snow-covered field at night. A bright white object hovered near the center. 3 dark figures stood below it. On the back, someone had written a date. November 31st, 1986. Nadine stared at it. "There is no November 31st. I turned the photograph over again. The date remained. Below it, in smaller writing, was the name of the photographer, Simon Greaves. I had been 8 years old in 1986 and living in Sacramento. I put the photograph back in the folder. Nadine asked me to take it out of the building. I drove to the Historical Society office instead of going home. The office was in an old railway depot near the edge of town. I unlocked the front door and checked our stored newspapers. We had bound copies of every Marlow Gazette from 1948 onward. The 1986 volume looked normal from the outside. Inside, the issues jumped from October 30th to December 4th. Every November edition had been removed with a razor or knife. The cut edges were clean. I called Frank Delaney, the former editor of the Gazette. He was 83 and lived in a retirement complex outside town. Frank agreed to meet me in the lobby. When I asked about November 1986, he became quiet. He said there had been reports of lights, but he could not remember publishing anything. I showed him the photocopied headline. He read it twice. Then he said, "That isn't my typeface." I pointed out that it matched the rest of the newspaper. He shook his head. We didn't have that machine until 1988. I asked whether anyone pressured him not to cover the sightings. Frank rubbed his hands together and looked toward the lobby windows. 2 men came in, he said. Not right after, before. Before the sightings? They asked what we planned to print. How would they know? Frank did not answer. He told me the men carried a calendar. It looked normal, except November had 31 days. They asked him which date the Valley was currently using. Frank thought they were joking and told them to leave. That night, he saw a bright object pass over his house. The next morning, 3 days had gone by. His wife remembered the missing days. Frank did not. He said the newspaper office was full of completed pages he had no memory of making. I showed him the photograph from the archives. He looked at the 3 figures beneath the light and pushed it back toward me. "One of them came to my house," he said. "Which one?" "The one in the middle." The figure in the photograph was too dark to identify. Frank refused to say anything else. When I left the retirement complex, the 2 men from the library were standing beside my car. Neither had left footprints in the thin snow. The older man smiled. "You continued the research." I asked how they knew where to find me. The younger man looked at the folder under my arm. Did he confirm the extra day? I did not answer. The older man held out his hand. "May we see the photograph?" That was the first time they had asked to examine any evidence. I kept the folder against my chest. "Why did you say 1986 never happened?" the younger man said. "Because it did not finish." The older man gave him a sharp look. I asked what that meant. Neither answered. I told them about the altered records, the missing files, and the date that did not exist. The older man said those were clerical problems. "Who are you?" I asked. He glanced toward the valley. "We correct sequence errors." "That doesn't mean anything." "It means enough." The younger man asked whether I had entered Wren Valley since the talk. I said no. He looked relieved. Then he asked if I had heard my name spoken when the radio failed. I had not mentioned the radio. I asked them why the valley mattered. The older man said, "The valley is not the concern." "What is?" "The year." They walked away before I could stop them. A dark sedan waited near the exit. The road was narrow and I saw no driver inside. The rear door opened as the men approached. Both climbed into the back. The sedan left without its headlights. I drove home before sunset. Rachel was in the kitchen when I arrived. She said I looked sick. I showed her the photograph. She studied it for a few seconds. "Why are you in this?" I thought she meant the name on the back, and she pointed at the field. The figure on the left was clearer than before. It wore a child's winter coat with a wide stripe across the chest. I had owned a coat like that when I was 8. I turned the picture over. The date had changed. November 30th, 1986. The extra day was gone. The name beneath it still read Simon Greaves. That night, I woke at 2:40 to the sound of voices outside. Rachel was asleep beside me. I went downstairs and looked through the front window. Several people stood in the road. They faced north toward Wren Valley. I recognized 2 neighbors and the man who delivered our mail. There were at least 6 others I did not know. None wore proper winter clothes. A pale light moved above the clouds. Every person in the road raised one hand at the same time. My phone vibrated. The screen displayed a calendar notification. November 31, Wren Valley. The current date was February 18th. I opened the notification. A map appeared showing the road from my house to the valley. A blue line traced the route. At the bottom was a message: return before the year closes. I deleted it. The people outside lowered their hands and walked away in different directions. By morning, the photograph had changed again. The field remained, but the bright object was gone. Only two dark figures stood in the snow. I drove the photograph to the Historical Society and locked it in the basement safe. Then I went home. For the next week, nothing happened. On Friday afternoon, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was the program from my library talk. The printed title had been altered. It now read, 69 Years of Unexplained Lights in Wren Valley. The year 1986 had been removed from the timeline. At the bottom of the page, someone had written, correction accepted. Behind the program was the photograph. The snow-covered field was empty. On the back, beneath my name, a new line had appeared. Subject returned home before November ended. The first alarm came on at 1:16 in the morning and cleared itself before I could stand up. I was working the overnight shift at the North Fork Water Treatment Plant outside Cedar Bluff, Iowa. The facility supplied drinking water to the town and a few smaller communities along the river. Most nights were quiet. I checked chemical levels, watched the intake pumps, filled out logs, and walked the building every hour. My name was Marcus Hale. I had worked there for 9 years. That night in early June was warm and still. There had been storms the day before, but the sky had cleared by sunset. No wind, no rain, and no lightning close enough to affect the equipment. The alarm appeared on the main control screen as low intake pressure. Before I could acknowledge it, the warning disappeared. The pressure reading returned to normal. I checked the event history. It showed the alarm lasting less than 1 second. That happened sometimes when a sensor failed or a signal cable picked up interference. I made a note and kept watching. About 3 minutes later, the raw water temperature dropped from 68 degrees to 41. It stayed there for 4 seconds and jumped back. The water came from the river. A drop that large was impossible unless the sensor had malfunctioned. I switched to the backup temperature probe. It showed the same thing. Then the chlorine feed rate increased by itself. Not much, about 6%. I switched it back to manual control and reduced it to the normal level. The system immediately moved it up again. I thought one of the automatic settings had been left active, but every control showed manual. I checked the remote terminal in the chemical room. It also showed the feed pump increasing without a command. I called my supervisor, Greg Maddox. He answered half asleep and asked if the water quality readings were within limits. They were. He told me to restart the control software if it happened again and call the electrical contractor in the morning. While I was still on the phone, every flow meter in the plant dropped to 0. The pumps kept running. I could hear them through the walls. The pipes were vibrating. Water continued moving through the treatment basins, but the screens showed 0 flow from the intake all the way to the distribution pumps. Greg was fully awake after that. He told me to check the physical gauges. I walked to the main pipe gallery. The mechanical gauges showed normal pressure. The pumps sounded steady. No leaks, no broken valves, no unusual vibration. Then the overhead lights dimmed. They did not flicker. They faded slowly until the gallery was almost dark, held there for a few seconds, and returned to normal. I looked at the emergency lights. They had not come on. That meant the plant had not lost power. The radio clipped to my belt made a soft clicking sound. I called the control room. No one answered because I was alone, but I wanted to know if the internal radio system still worked. My voice echoed faintly through a speaker near the ceiling, delayed by several seconds. Then another voice came through. It sounded like a woman whispering. I could not understand the words. I asked Greg if he heard it through the phone. The call had disconnected. My phone showed no service. That was unusual. Cell coverage was not great near the river, but I normally had 2 or 3 bars inside the plant. I went back toward the control room. On the way, I passed the filtration hall. The hall had 4 large rectangular basins with walkways between them. The water surface was usually rough from air and flow. That night, all 4 basins were completely still. The pumps were running. Water should have been moving. I stopped at the doorway. The water looked dark and flat like black glass. A pale circle appeared beneath the surface of the nearest basin. At first, I thought one of the underwater lights had turned on. We had lights mounted along the walls for inspection, but they produced narrow yellow beams. This glow was white and spread evenly across an area about 10 feet wide. It moved slowly toward the center of the basin. I walked to the railing. The circle passed under me. The metal handrail became cold beneath my palm. Not cool from the water. Cold enough that I pulled my hand away. The glow continued into the second basin without crossing the concrete divider between them. It simply appeared on the other side. Then it moved into the third basin. The radio clicked again. The whispering voice said something that sounded like my name. Marcus. I backed away from the railing. The pale circle reached the fourth basin and stopped. For several seconds, it remained in place. Then all four basins began moving at once. The water surged toward the north wall as if the entire building had tilted. It struck the concrete sides and rolled back. No alarms sounded. The pumps did not change speed. I ran to the control room. Every instrument displayed a different problem. The river level showed -6 feet. The chlorine residual showed 0 and then jumped above the top of the scale. The finished water temperature read 104 degrees. The plant clock had stopped at 123. I checked my phone. It showed 131. The wall clock showed 123. The microwave clock in the break room showed 123. I restarted the control system. The monitors went black. When they returned, the readings were normal. The event log contained no alarms after 1/16. The pressure drop, temperature change, feed adjustment, and zero flow were gone. The plant clock still showed 1:23. I called Greg from the landline. He answered immediately and asked why I had hung up. I told him what happened. He said we had only been disconnected for about 30 seconds. I looked at my phone. It showed 1:32. From my point of view, the call had been gone for at least 10 minutes. Greg told me to shut down the affected control panel and use the backup system. He said he would come in early. I switched controls and began checking water samples manually. The first sample looked normal. The second had a metallic smell. It reminded me of pennies or wet electrical wiring. I tested the chlorine, pH, turbidity, and temperature. Everything was within normal range. I sealed the sample bottle and labeled it. A dark line formed inside the glass. It started at the bottom and moved upward through the water. It was thin and straight, like a crack, but the bottle was not damaged. When the line reached the surface, the water cleared. The smell disappeared. I took another sample. That one was normal. At 1:47, a call came into the plant office. The caller ID showed a local number I did not recognize. I answered. No one spoke. I heard breathing and a faint humming sound. Then a man asked, "Did the pressure return on its own?" I asked who was calling. He repeated the question. I said the readings had returned to normal. Without correction, I restarted the system. The line went quiet. Then he asked, "Did the water move?" I did not answer. The call disconnected. I wrote down the number and tried calling back. A recorded message said the number was not in service. Around 2, I heard something outside the control room. It sounded like someone walking along the covered walkway between the main building and the intake station. The exterior doors were locked. The front gate required a code, and security cameras covered the entire property. I looked at the camera monitor. The walkway was empty. The footsteps continued, slow steps on metal grating. They stopped outside the side door. The handle moved down. I checked the lock. It was secure. 3 soft taps came against the glass. I turned off the control room lights so I could see outside. No one stood there. The yard lights were on. The fence, chemical tanks, and parked county truck were clearly visible. Beyond the fence, near the river, a white light hovered above the trees. It was about the size of a street lamp from that distance, but there was no pole beneath it. The light moved sideways. It passed behind one tree and appeared in front of another without changing brightness. I watched it for maybe a minute. Then a second light appeared lower to the ground. The two moved together toward the intake building. The building's exterior lights shut off. The camera feed went gray. A low vibration passed through the floor. I felt it in my feet and teeth. The pressure gauge on the control panel began rising. not the digital reading. The old mechanical gauge mounted beside it. The needle moved past the normal range and continued upward until it hit the metal stop. No pipes shook. No relief valves opened. Then the needle dropped to 0. The 2 lights vanished. The intake building lights came back on. The security camera showed the walkway again. A person stood outside the intake door. The image was grainy, but the figure looked tall and very thin. It faced the camera and did not move. I switched to another angle. The same area appeared empty. I went back to the first camera. The figure remained. It raised one arm and pointed toward the river. The feed cut to black. I called the county sheriff's office. A deputy named Laura Vance arrived at 2:25. By the time she came through the gate, the instruments had returned to normal. The exterior lights worked and the cameras showed no one on the property. Laura searched the intake building and fence line. She found no sign of entry. Near the riverbank, she noticed a circular patch where the grass had been pressed flat. It was about 12 feet across. The blades all leaned toward the middle. There were no footprints leading to it. Laura asked if a helicopter had landed. I said I had not heard one. She took pictures and checked the road outside the gate. No tire tracks, except mine and hers. I showed her the camera footage. The recording skipped from 2:03 to 2:11. The figure was not in the saved video. Laura stayed until 3. Before leaving, she told me 2 residents on County Line Road had called dispatch about bright lights near the river. Both callers said their radios and phones stopped working for several minutes. I asked if anyone else had reported it. She said not yet. Greg arrived at 4:40. We checked the system logs, backup controls, electrical panels, and sensor records. The plant showed no power interruption. Every instrument had passed its automatic checks. The sealed sample bottle I had left on the lab counter was empty. The cap was still screwed on. The label remained dry. At the bottom of the bottle was a thin gray residue that smelled metallic when Greg opened it. He told me to go home and get some sleep. I drove back to Cedar Bluff just after sunrise. The town looked normal. People were leaving for work. A school bus passed me near the grocery store. At home, my wife, Hannah, was in the kitchen. She asked why I had called her around 2. I told her I had not. She showed me her phone. There was an incoming call from the plant number at 2:06. It had lasted 3 minutes. She said no one spoke, but she heard water running and a man breathing. Near the end, someone whispered her name. I did not tell her about the voice on my radio. I slept until noon. At 1, Greg called and said 2 men were at the plant asking to speak with me. I told him I was off duty. He said they already knew my home address and were probably on their way. They arrived 20 minutes later. The first man was tall with gray hair and a narrow face. The other was younger and heavier, with dark hair combed neatly to one side. Both wore light gray suits. It was 80 degrees outside, but their jackets were buttoned. They introduced themselves as environmental health investigators. Neither showed identification until I asked. The older man opened a black wallet for less than a second. I saw a white card with a circular seal, but not enough to read it. They asked if they could come inside. I said no. We spoke on the porch. The younger man asked what time the instruments changed. I said around 1:16. He asked whether the readings failed together or in sequence. I explained the order. He wrote it down. The older man asked whether the finished water supply had been interrupted. No. Did any untreated water enter distribution? No. Were any physical corrections required? Not really. The readings returned after I restarted the system. The 2 men looked at each other. Neither asked about equipment damage, water safety, chemical levels, or the source of the failure. The younger man asked, "Did nearby residents report unusual dreams afterward?" I thought I had misheard him. What? Dreams, repeated images, water, lights, enclosed rooms. I told him I had not asked anyone about dreams. He nodded. He did not look surprised. The older man asked if I had slept since leaving the facility. I said yes. Did you dream? I told him I did not remember. He asked whether my wife had. I stepped in front of the door. That has nothing to do with the plant. The older man remained polite. It may be relevant to the fluctuation. What kind of environmental investigation asks about dreams? He ignored that. The younger man asked if I had heard anyone use my name through the radio. I did not answer. He wrote something. I asked who sent them. The older man said they were reviewing a temporary water event. Nothing happened to the water. We know. That answer bothered me. I asked if they had been to the plant. The younger man said, "Not this time." The older man looked at him. They both went quiet. I asked what he meant. Neither answered. The older man thanked me and said the facility should continue operating normally. Before leaving, the younger man asked one more question. Did the water move toward the north wall first? I stared at him. I had not told Greg, Laura, or anyone else which direction the water moved. The older man touched the younger man's elbow. They walked down the driveway. A dark sedan waited at the corner with its engine running. I could not see a driver. Both men got into the rear seat. The car pulled away. That evening, Laura called me. She said dispatch had received 6 calls from homes near the plant. No one reported illness or bad water. 4 people said they had dreamed about standing inside a dark building while water rose around their feet. One woman said she dreamed that 2 men stood at the end of her bed asking whether she had heard the river stop. Laura asked if that meant anything to me. I said no. I returned to work the following night. The plant instruments were normal. Greg had replaced the intake pressure sensor and locked the control cabinet. At 1:16, every monitor went blank for 1 second. When the displays returned, a new line appeared in the event log. It did not match any system code. Resident response incomplete. I printed the screen. The printer produced a blank sheet. The message disappeared before I could photograph it. I finished the shift without another problem. When I got home, Hannah was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She said she had dreamed about the treatment plant. In the dream, she stood in the filtration hall beside 4 still basins. A white circle moved beneath the water. 2 men watched from the far walkway. She asked them what they wanted. One of them said, "We were checking who noticed." Hannah said there had been someone else in the room with her. A tall figure stood behind the glass of the control booth. She could not see its face. In the dream, every gauge pointed north. She woke at 1:23. On the table between us was the sealed sample bottle from the plant. I had left it in the lab. It was filled with clear water. A thin, dark line stood upright in the center, running from the bottom of the bottle to the surface. Neither of us touched it. After a few seconds, the line bent slowly toward the north wall of the kitchen. I first saw the 2 men on the hillside just after 6 in the morning. I had gone out to count short-eared owls near a stretch of open moorland outside Hexham in Northumberland. It was late February, cold and dry, with a pale strip of light beginning to show above the eastern fields. The hillside was part of a large sheep farm, but there was a public footpath running along the lower fence. My name was Daniel Mercer. I had been bird watching for about 12 years. I was not one of those people who could identify every call in half a second, but I knew the local species and kept decent records. The men stood about 300 yards above me. They were side by side near an old stone wall, both wearing dark suits. One was tall and thin. The other was shorter and broad through the shoulders. Neither wore a hat. That caught my attention because there was a hard frost and a steady wind coming across the hill. I had on thermal layers, gloves, a wool cap, and a waterproof coat. They looked dressed for an office. At first, I thought they might be estate agents or surveyors. Then I noticed they had no equipment. No bags, maps, binoculars, cameras, or phones. They simply stood there looking up. I followed their line of sight. The sky was mostly clear. A few high clouds moved east, and one passenger plane crossed far to the south. I saw nothing unusual. I watched the men for maybe a minute. Neither spoke or shifted position. Then a flock of lapwings lifted from the field between us. The birds rose together, circled once, and moved away from the hillside. As they passed near the men, the flock broke apart. Some birds turned sharply north. Others dropped back toward the ground. The 2 men did not react. I raised my binoculars. The taller one had very pale skin and dark hair combed straight back. The shorter man appeared older, with gray hair and a round face. Both stared above the ridge. The taller man's mouth moved. I could not hear anything from that distance, but he seemed to be counting. I lowered the binoculars to check the birds. When I looked back, the men were gone. The hillside was open. The wall ran east to west with no trees nearby. They could have crouched behind it, but the ground on the far side sloped upward. I should have seen their heads. I walked farther along the path and checked the gate leading toward the ridge. It was locked with a heavy chain. There were no fresh footprints in the frost on my side. I told myself they had walked down the back of the hill. The following Saturday, I went to the same area. The weather had changed. Low cloud covered the ridge, and light rain drifted across the fields. I arrived later around 7. The two men were there again. Same place. Same suits. They stood close to the wall, looking upward. The taller one had his hands at his sides. The shorter man held one hand near his chest, as if checking a watch, though I could not see one. I watched them through the binoculars. The rain did not seem to affect their clothes. Their shoulders looked dry. A kestrel hovered over the slope below them. It remained in one place for several seconds, beating its wings into the wind. Then it folded its wings and dropped suddenly. I expected it to dive toward prey. Instead, it stopped halfway down. For one brief moment, the bird appeared completely still in the air. No wing movement, no falling. Then it jerked sideways and flew low across the field. I lost sight of it near the road. The shorter man turned his head toward me. Even at that distance, I knew he was looking directly at me. I lowered the binoculars. He continued facing my position. The taller man did not move. I pretended to check something in my notebook. When I looked again, both men were staring at me. I felt embarrassed more than afraid. Birdwatchers sometimes look suspicious, standing around with binoculars near private land. I thought maybe they worked for the farm and wanted to know what I was doing. I raised one hand in greeting. Neither responded. A bank of mist moved across the upper hillside. When it cleared, the men were gone. I checked the time. It was 7:18. My camera clock showed 7:31. I had taken several photos of the kestrel, so I looked through them. The first images showed the bird hovering. In the background, the two men stood beside the wall. In the final photo, the kestrel had vanished. The men remained, but both were facing the camera. I enlarged the image. Their faces were blurred even though the wall behind them was sharp. The taller man had one arm raised. He appeared to be pointing at something above me. I looked up without thinking. The cloud cover was low and uniform. Near the center of it was a darker patch, roughly circular, moving against the wind. It was faint enough that I might not have noticed it without the photograph. I watched it drift toward the ridge. A low humming sound passed over the field. It was not loud. I felt it in my jaw more than I heard it. Every sheep on the hillside stopped grazing. They turned their heads toward the dark patch. The humming ended. The sheep returned to normal. I left soon after that. Over the next month, I saw the men 4 more times. Always at dawn, always on the same part of the hillside. They never arrived while I was there. They were simply present when I looked up. They never carried equipment. They never watched birds, livestock, vehicles, or people. Only the sky. The third time, the taller man stood several feet away from the shorter one. He kept looking north while the shorter man stared straight up. A small white light moved above them. It did not blink. It traveled slowly across the clouds, stopped, then moved backward along the same path. I took out my phone. The screen showed no signal, and the camera would not open. The white light faded. Both men turned at exactly the same moment and looked toward me. The phone started working again. The fourth time, I brought my friend Priya. She worked with me at a printing company in Newcastle and had recently started birdwatching. I had not told her much about the men because I wanted to know whether she noticed them on her own. We arrived at 5:50 on a clear morning in March. The hillside was empty. We walked the lower path and stopped near a small pond where curlews sometimes fed. At 6:07, Priya asked who the men were. They stood near the wall. I had checked that spot less than a minute earlier. They wore the same suits. Priya raised her binoculars. "That's strange," she said. "What?" "They're not looking at the same thing." From where I stood, both appeared to be staring straight up. Priya handed me her binoculars. The taller man's head was angled slightly east. The shorter one looked west. Their eyes seemed fixed on separate points. I scanned the sky. 2 faint lights moved high above the ridge. One approached from the east, the other from the west. They traveled at the same speed. As they came closer together, the men slowly turned their heads. The lights met directly above the wall. They did not pass. They stopped side by side. A line appeared between them. It was thin and pale, like a scratch across the sky. Priya lowered the binoculars. "Can you see that?" I said yes. The line grew brighter. The air around us became very still. The wind dropped completely, and the reeds beside the pond stopped moving. Somewhere behind us, a skylark began singing. The call repeated the same short pattern over and over without changing. The pale line folded in the middle. That was the only way I could describe it. The two lights moved closer, but not across the sky. The space between them seemed to narrow. Then both disappeared. The wind returned. The skylark stopped. Priya checked her phone. It was 6:26. Mine showed the same time. We had arrived at the pond around 6. The event had felt like 2 or 3 minutes. Neither of us remembered the missing time. The men were no longer on the hillside. Priya wanted to leave. On the way back to the car, we found a dead patch in the grass beside the path. It was about 6 feet across and perfectly round. The grass inside was flattened toward the center. There was a metallic smell in the air. Priya took a photograph. The image showed normal grass. The circle did not appear. After that, she refused to return. I stayed away for 2 weeks. During that time, I checked property records and old maps. The hillside belonged to a farmer named George Bell. His family had owned it since the 1940s. I called him and asked whether surveyors had been working near the stone wall. He said no. I described the men. George went quiet. Then he asked, "They still wearing suits?" The words still bothered me. I asked if he had seen them. He said his father had. In the late 60s, George's father noticed 2 men standing near the same wall before sunrise. They appeared several mornings in a row and watched the sky. One morning, the sheep refused to cross the upper field. His father found a long black mark in the grass and assumed lightning had struck, though there had been no storm. The men stopped appearing after that. I asked if he knew who they were. George said no. Then he told me not to go near them. He would not explain why. I returned the next morning. I told myself I was going to stay near the road, take a few photographs, and leave. The weather was unusually warm for March. Thin cloud covered the sun, and the air had that heavy feeling it got before rain. The 2 men stood on the hillside. This time they were lower down. They had crossed the wall and moved into the field closest to the public path. I stopped. The shorter man raised one hand. He pointed toward the gate. The chain was gone. The gate stood open. I did not move. The taller man looked above my head. A faint ticking sound came from inside my camera bag. I opened it. The spare batteries were warm. My compass, which I carried for walking routes, spun slowly inside its plastic case. The red needle made one full turn and stopped, pointing uphill. The shorter man lowered his hand. Both turned and began walking toward the wall. Their movements looked normal, but they covered ground too quickly. With each step, they seemed several feet farther away than they should have been. I followed at a distance. I did not cross the gate. I stayed on the path and watched through binoculars. The men reached the wall. They did not climb it. They stopped in front of the stones and disappeared, not behind it. One moment they stood there. The next, the hillside was empty. The humming returned. A dark shape appeared above the clouds. It was large and flat with no clear edges. The clouds moved around it but never crossed in front of it. The compass needle pointed upward against the plastic cover. Then I heard footsteps behind me. The 2 men stood on the path. They were less than 10 feet away. I had not heard them approach. Up close, their suits looked old-fashioned. The fabric was heavy and dark with narrow lapels. Neither wore a tie pin, watch, or wedding ring. The taller man had gray eyes. The shorter man's eyes were almost black. The taller one said, "You have been here 7 times." His voice was quiet and flat. I said I had lost count. The shorter man looked at my binoculars. "Do you record numbers?" "Bird numbers." "Only birds?" I asked what they wanted. The taller man looked toward the ridge. "To confirm passage." He ignored the question. The shorter man asked whether I had noticed fewer birds after the lights appeared. I thought about the lapwings, the cranes, and the quiet fields. I said I had not counted. "You should not count afterward," he said. I asked why. Neither answered. The dark shape above the clouds shifted. The taller man tilted his head. The shorter one said, "It is early." "For what?" Again, no answer. A pressure built inside my ears. The men looked upward. The cloud layer opened in a narrow circle above the hillside. There was no blue sky beyond it. The opening was dark. A white light appeared at its center. Every bird in the valley lifted at once. Lapwings, crows, gulls, starlings, and smaller birds I could not identify rose from fields, trees, and hedges. They filled the air without calling. The flock moved toward the dark opening. I stood frozen beside the gate. The birds circled below the clouds. The taller man began counting under his breath. The shorter man watched the flock. Some birds turned away and dropped back toward the fields. Others continued upward. When they reached the white light, they became dark points and disappeared. I grabbed my phone and tried to record. The screen showed the hillside, the flock, and the clouds. The two men did not appear in the image. The taller man stopped counting. He said 3 remained. The shorter one looked toward me. 4. They disagreed in the same calm tone people used when checking a receipt. Then both looked at my phone. The screen went black. The pressure in my ears released. The birds scattered. The dark opening closed as the clouds moved together. The sky looked normal again. The taller man stepped closer. "Did you see 4 return?" I said. "I did not know." "You watched." "I wasn't counting." He looked at the shorter man. The shorter one nodded slightly. They turned away. I asked who they were. The taller man stopped. For the first time, his expression changed. He looked tired. "We were here before the birds." Then they walked uphill. I watched until mist formed along the ridge and covered them. My phone came back on. The time was 8:42. It had been 6:19 when the birds lifted. I had been standing there for more than 2 hours. The hillside was empty. The gate was locked again, with the chain wrapped around it. I walked back to my car. The car park contained one other vehicle, a dark gray saloon with no visible number plate. As I approached, the rear door opened. No one got out. I kept walking. The door remained open until I passed. Inside, the back seat was empty. On the seat lay a pair of binoculars. They looked identical to mine. The saloon pulled away without the rear door closing. It turned onto the road and disappeared behind the trees. When I reached home, I checked the photographs on my camera. Most were blank gray frames. One showed the hillside during the flock's ascent. Hundreds of birds filled the sky. Near the wall stood the 2 men. Above them was a dark circular opening in the clouds. At the bottom of the image, 4 birds flew away from the main flock. 3 were clear. The 4th was only a faint outline. I enlarged it. The shape had wings, but it did not look like a bird. It was too narrow through the body, with long straight legs hanging beneath it. Its head faced backward toward the opening. The following dawn, I woke to tapping against my bedroom window. 4 soft taps. I opened the curtains. Nothing stood outside. On the roof of the house opposite, the 2 men watched the sky. The taller one raised his hand and held up 3 fingers. The shorter man held up 4. A flock of starlings passed overhead. When it cleared, both men were gone. The padlock felt warm, even though the whole storage building was cold. I noticed it as soon as I wrapped my hand around the body of the lock. The unit was in an old storage place outside Spokane, Washington, near a stretch of industrial lots and railroad sidings. The facility had changed owners a few times and was mostly used by contractors, estate liquidators, and people storing furniture they had forgotten about. My name was Joel Ramirez. I had worked as a locksmith for 16 years. Most storage calls were simple. Someone lost a key, stopped paying rent, or bought a unit at auction and needed the old lock removed. That morning in January was clear and freezing. Snow from the week before had turned hard along the edges of the lot. The sun was out, but it had not warmed anything. The manager, a woman named Kendra Moss, met me at the gate around 8. She said Unit C-17 had not been opened in at least 12 years. The original renter had disappeared from their records after the storage company was sold. No current phone number, no working address, and no payment history after 2011. Somehow, the unit had never been cleared. It got overlooked during one ownership change, then sealed during another. A new owner had bought it at auction the day before. He was supposed to meet us at 9. Kendra led me through 2 rows of metal buildings to a narrow section near the back fence. C-17 had a roll-up door with faded blue paint and a heavy brass padlock. The lock was old but good quality. No rust around the shackle, no scratches near the keyway, no obvious tool marks. That was strange after so many years. Locks exposed to weather usually showed something. Dust, corrosion, dirt packed into the mechanism. This one looked like it had been installed recently, except the brass had darkened with age. I touched it again. Warm, not hot enough to burn, just warmer than my hand. Kendra noticed me staring. "What?" I asked if anyone had tried opening it recently. She said no. The facility had cut most of the abandoned locks before the auction, but C-17 was listed separately because the contents had never been inventoried. I used a flashlight to inspect the keyway. There was a thin, dark residue inside. It smelled metallic, almost like old batteries. I tried a tension tool. The plug did not move. I used lubricant. Still nothing. The lock was not frozen. It felt blocked from inside, as if something solid sat behind the pins. I told Kendra I would probably need to drill it. She shrugged and said the buyer had approved whatever was necessary. While I set up my tools, I heard tires on the gravel. A black sedan came around the corner and stopped about 30 feet away. Two men got out. Both wore dark coats and plain trousers. One was tall, with gray hair and a narrow face. The other was younger, heavier, and had very pale eyebrows. They did not look like people who bought storage units. The older man walked toward us and asked if the owner had arrived. Kendra said no. He looked at the lock. Then he offered her $5,000 for the contents of the unit. Kendra laughed because she thought he was joking. He said he was serious. The younger man held a white envelope in one hand. It looked thick. Kendra explained the unit had already been sold at auction and they would have to deal with the buyer. The older man said they preferred not to involve him. I asked if they knew what was inside. He said no. That answer made no sense. Storage auctions were mostly junk. Old couches, mattresses, boxes of clothes, broken tools. Nobody offered $5,000 without seeing the contents unless they knew something. Kendra asked their names. The older man gave the name Paul Dyer. The younger one did not introduce himself. Kendra asked how they had heard about the unit. Paul ignored that. He looked at me and asked whether I had started opening the lock. I said I had tested it. Did it turn? No. Did the shackle move? No. Did it show signs of prior entry? I told him it did not. The younger man watched my face closely. None, he asked. Not that I can see. The two men looked at each other. The younger one lowered the envelope. Paul thanked us and said they would wait for the owner. They returned to the sedan but did not get inside. They stood beside it, looking towards C-17. Kendra muttered that they were probably collectors who knew the original renter. I asked who the renter had been. She checked the old sheet on her clipboard. The name was Edwin Sorrell. I had never heard it. I started drilling the lock. The first bit barely marked the brass. I switched to a harder bit and tried again. The drill motor slowed as soon as it touched the keyway. The battery indicator dropped from full to 1 bar. I pulled it away. The battery showed full again. I tried with a second drill. Same thing. The motor struggled, the lights on the tool dimmed, and the metal body became cold. The lock stayed warm. Kendra stepped back. I took out a small grinder. Before I turned it on, a low humming sound came from inside the unit. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Kendra heard it too. She asked if there was power inside. There was not. The whole row had been disconnected years earlier. I knocked on the metal door. The sound was dull, like the unit was packed tightly from floor to ceiling. Then something knocked back. One soft tap. Kendra looked at me. I waited. A second tap came from farther inside. Then a third. I asked if there could be an animal trapped in there. She said the units were not connected and there were no openings except small roof vents. The men by the sedan had turned toward us. The younger one raised a hand, not waving, more like he wanted us to stop. I ignored him and started the grinder. The wheel touched the shackle. Every light in the storage facility went out. The office, gate lamps, and security lights all shut off at once. The grinder stopped in my hand. The black sedan's headlights came on. The light from them looked pale and flat against the snow. Kendra took out her phone. It had no signal. Mine did not either. Then the humming returned. This time it came from beneath the concrete. I felt it through my boots. The lock clicked. The shackle lifted by itself. Not all the way, about half an inch. The humming stopped. The lights came back on. The grinder restarted for a second before I released the trigger. The two men were standing closer now. I had not seen them move. Paul asked, "Did it open?" I said not yet. He looked relieved. The younger man stared at the raised shackle. "Do not pull it," he said. Kendra told them to stay back. Paul held up both hands. "We only need to know whether it was opened before today." I said I had already answered that. "Look again," he said. I turned the lock over. On the back were 4 shallow marks. They had not been there before. They looked like narrow scratches, evenly spaced and running vertically. I rubbed one with my thumb. The brass felt colder there. Kendra asked if someone had tried cutting it in the past. I said the marks were too clean and too shallow. The younger man asked if the marks reached the edge. I said no. He nodded as if that mattered. At 8:47, the auction buyer arrived. His name was Curtis Lang. He was in his early 30s and drove a white cargo van with a trailer. He bought storage units, cleaned out houses, and resold furniture online. He got out smiling until he noticed the 2 men. Paul approached and offered him the same $5,000. Curtis asked what was inside. Paul said he did not know. Curtis laughed and refused. He had paid $300 for the unit and probably would have taken $5,000 under normal circumstances, but the offer made him suspicious. He said if they were willing to pay that much sight unseen, then something valuable had to be inside. Paul did not argue. He only asked if Curtis had ever met Edwin Sorrell. Curtis said no. The younger man asked whether anyone had given him a key. No. Any instructions? No. Any warning not to open it? Curtis looked at me. "What is this?" I told him I did not know. Paul stepped away. "Proceed," he said. The way he said it bothered me. It sounded like permission. I pulled the shackle. The lock opened. A sharp metallic smell came out around the door before we lifted it. Curtis grabbed the handle and rolled the door up about a foot. Cold air spilled from inside. It was colder than outside by a noticeable amount. The bottom of the unit was dark, but I could see cardboard boxes stacked close to the door. Curtis raised it higher. The humming started again. The boxes were old and unmarked. Behind them stood several wooden crates and a metal shelving unit. Everything was covered with a thin layer of gray dust, except for a narrow path running down the center. The path looked recently cleared. No footprints showed in the dust. Curtis took out a flashlight and stepped inside. The 2 men stayed outside. I noticed that neither looked at the contents. They watched the floor near Curtis's feet. Kendra told Curtis to wait while she documented the opening. She took photographs from the doorway. Her phone flash went off. Something moved at the back of the unit. It was quick and low, maybe a shadow passing behind the shelves. Curtis stopped. "Did you see that?" I had. Kendra said it might have been a rat. The unit was too cold for rats, and there were no droppings or chewed boxes near the entrance. Curtis moved deeper inside. The path led to a work table against the rear wall. On it sat a row of glass jars, a portable cassette recorder, and a stack of black and white photographs. The jars were empty. Each had a date written on the lid. The oldest was from 1974, the newest was from 2008. Curtis picked up one photograph. Paul spoke from outside. "Do not turn it over." Curtis turned it over. There was writing on the back. He read it aloud. 3 lights above Hangman Valley. No aircraft sound. 11 missing minutes. The picture showed a dark field with 3 bright points in the sky. Another photo showed a farmhouse at night. A pale shape stood near the fence. The image was blurred, but it looked taller than a person. Kendra asked Paul if he knew what the photos were. He said no. I did not believe him. Curtis found a small metal box beneath the table. It had no lock. Inside were cassette tapes, notebooks, and a ring holding several keys. One key matched the padlock we had just opened. Curtis held it up. The younger man finally looked inside the unit. His face tightened. "That key should not be there," he said. Curtis asked why. No answer. I took the key and compared it with the lock. It fit. The edges were clean and there was no rust. I turned it once. The lock worked perfectly. Kendra asked how the unit had remained sealed if the key was inside. Paul asked me whether the lock had resisted turning before I drilled it. I said yes. Did the internal pins feel set? They felt blocked. He wrote something in a small notebook. Curtis had started opening the cardboard boxes. Most contained ordinary things: clothes, newspapers, receipts, maps, and old camera equipment. One box held dozens of alarm clocks. Every clock had stopped. The times were different, but none showed minutes between 2 and 2:30. Another box contained compasses. Curtis set one on the table. The needle spun, slowed, and pointed toward the rear wall. He placed another beside it. Same direction. I used my phone compass. It pointed south for a moment, then rotated toward the wall too. The older man, Paul, stepped backward. The younger one asked, "Has the rear panel been disturbed?" Kendra said there was no rear panel, just the metal wall of the unit. He asked if another storage room sat behind it. She checked the map. Nothing did. C-17 was built against the outer edge of the property. Beyond the wall was a drainage ditch and the railroad embankment. Curtis moved toward the back. The metallic smell grew stronger. A vertical seam showed in the metal wall behind the table. It looked like a door had been cut into it and covered with matching panels. I had not noticed it from the entrance. Curtis ran his hand along the seam. The humming